September 5th, 1847 marked the beginning of a life that would eventually drown the American Midwest in blood. In the humid, hemp-growing hills of Clay County, Missouri, Jesse Woodson James was born into a world of contradictions and simmering violence. He was not born into poverty or crime, but into the respectable household of Robert James, a Baptist minister and slave-owning hemp farmer who had migrated from Kentucky to the region known as Little Dixie. The soil here was rich, black, and fertile, and the society was structured around the Southern institutions of land and chattel slavery. For the first few years of his life, Jesse was a typical boy of the frontier aristocracy, surrounded by the comforts of a successful farm and the fervent religious teachings of his father. However, the stability was short-lived. In 1850, Robert James felt the pull of the gold rush and left his family to minister to the miners in California. He never returned, dying of cholera in a distant, dusty camp, leaving 3-year-old Jesse fatherless and his mother, Zerelda, to manage a farm and 3 children alone. Zerelda James was not a woman to be pitied. She was a towering figure of iron will, fierce intelligence, and an unyielding loyalty to the Southern cause. She remarried twice, eventually settling with Dr. Reuben Samuel, a quiet, mild-mannered physician who moved into the James farmhouse. Jesse grew up under the tutelage of a strong, domineering mother who instilled in him a deep resentment of Northern interference and a belief in the righteousness of their way of life. As the 1850s bled into the 1860s, the political landscape of Missouri fractured. The Civil War did not begin for Jesse with the firing on Fort Sumter. It began on his doorstep. Clay County became a powder keg where neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and the line between soldier and civilian evaporated. His older brother, Frank James, a serious and bookish young man, joined the Missouri State Guard early to fight for the Confederacy, leaving the teenage Jesse behind to tend the farm. The war came for Jesse personally in the spring of 1863. Union militia, specifically the enrolled Missouri militia, were patrolling the county, hunting for guerrillas and their sympathizers. They arrived at the James Samuel farm with the intent to punish. A squad of blue-clad soldiers rode onto the property, their faces hard with the license of martial law. They were looking for Frank and information on the bushwhackers. They found Dr. Reuben Samuel. To extract information, the soldiers dragged the doctor from his house and threw a rope over the limb of a coffee bean tree. They hoisted him up by the neck, choking the life out of him, dropping him only when he was on the brink of death, then hoisting him again. It was a mock execution designed to terrify. While his stepfather gasped for air, turning purple in the noose, the soldiers turned, their attention to 15-year-old Jesse. He was in the cornfield plowing the rows. The soldiers surrounded the boy. They did not treat him as a child. They lashed him with heavy ropes, whipping him across the back until his shirt was shredded and his skin was flayed. They taunted him, demanding to know where the guerrillas were hiding. Jesse, displaying the stoic defiance that would define his criminal career, refused to speak. The soldiers rode away, leaving a family broken, humiliated, and radicalized. The whipping did not break Jesse James. It forged him. It stripped away any lingering hesitation or moral qualms about killing. He looked at the bruises on his stepfather's neck and felt the scars on his own back. And he swore a vengeance that would consume the rest of his life. By 1864, at the age of 16, Jesse had left the plow for the pistol. He rode into the brush to join the bushwhackers, the irregular cavalry who fought under the black flag. He fell in with the most vicious company of men on the border. The group led by William T. Anderson, known to history as Bloody Bill. Anderson was a homicidal maniac driven by the collapse of the fatal prison in Kansas City that had killed his sisters. Under Anderson's tutelage, Jesse learned the trade of the guerrilla. He learned to sleep in the saddle, to eat raw corn, and to kill without compunction. He traded his farm clothes for the guerrilla's uniform, an embroidered shirt, 4 to 6 heavy percussion revolvers, and a mount that could outrun anything the Union cavalry could field. September 27, 1864, dawned over the fractured landscape of Boone County, Missouri, with a damp, clinging chill that foretold the coming winter. The region lay silent under a gray sky, the mud of the roads churned into a paste by the constant movement of irregular cavalry. Out of the morning mist rode a column of 80 heavily armed men, their presence announcing not a military maneuver but a raid of extermination. Among them, riding knee to knee with seasoned killers, was 16-year-old Jesse Woodson James. He sat atop a bay gelding, his body lean and angular, his face unscarred and deceptively boyish, blinking rapidly with a nervous tick that vanished the moment his hand touched the walnut grip of his revolver. These were not the gray-clad soldiers of the Confederacy, but Anderson's bushwhackers, men who fought under the black flag of no quarter. They wore Union blue stolen from the corpses of previous skirmishes, the tunics altered with intricate embroidery and silk ribbons woven into their hair, a grotesque parody of military uniform that signaled their chaotic allegiance only to themselves and their leader, William T. Anderson. Anderson, known as Bloody Bill, led the column with a terrifying manic energy, his long hair matted and his beard wild, eyes scanning the horizon for prey. The men behind him bristled with weaponry, carrying 3, 4, or even 6 revolvers apiece, Colt Navies, Remington New Model Armies, and Savage Navy pistols, jammed into waistbands and leather holsters slung across their chests. Jesse adjusted the heavy dragoon pistol at his hip, feeling the cold weight of the iron. He watched the older men mimicking their slouch, their callous disregard for the cold, and the way they held their reins with a looseness that belied their readiness to kill. They approached the town of Centralia, a small, undefended depot stop on the North Missouri Railroad, shortly before 10 o'clock in the morning. The town was quiet, its residents going about their Tuesday morning routines, unaware that the war was about to descend upon them with absolute fury. The guerrillas swept into Centralia with a sudden, overwhelming violence that paralyzed the town instantly. They blocked the roads and cut the telegraph wires, the metallic snip of the cutters severing the town's only link to the outside world. Jesse rode his horse onto the wooden sidewalk, the hooves thundering on the planks, forcing pedestrians to dive into the mud for safety. The bushwhackers dismounted and began a systematic looting of the settlement. They kicked open the doors of the general store and the saloon, dragging terrified shopkeepers out by their collars. Barrels of whiskey were breached, the amber liquid flowing into cups, boots, and directly into the throats of the raiders. Jesse joined in the pillaging, grabbing armfuls of boots and canned goods, tossing aside what he did not want, watching as the older men smashed display cases and pocketed anything that glittered. The air filled with the sounds of shattering glass, rough laughter, and the pleading of the locals. For 3 hours, the gang held the town hostage. They terrorized the populace, demanding meals be cooked and served to them at gunpoint. Jesse sat at a table in the hotel, eating ham and biscuits while his revolver lay next to his plate, the muzzle pointing toward the kitchen where the trembling women worked. The violence was simmering, a tension that tightened the air until it was difficult to breathe. Then at 11:30 in the morning, the distant, mournful whistle of a steam locomotive cut through the noise of the occupation. The train from St. Louis was approaching from the east. Anderson's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. He ordered his men to clear the tracks of their horses and to conceal themselves, leaving only a few men visible on the platform to act as a lure. They piled railroad ties and heavy logs across the rails just beyond the depot, creating an impassable barrier that would force the train to halt or derail. The locomotive, a massive black iron engine, slowed as it neared the station. The engineer, seeing the obstructions and the men on the platform, applied the brakes. The wheels locked, screeching and grinding against the iron rails. throwing sparks as the heavy train slid to a halt. The steam hissed loudly, venting from the boiler, masking the sound of the guerrillas emerging from their hiding spots. Before the train had fully stopped, the bushwhackers swarmed it. They climbed the steps of the passenger cars, weapons drawn, shouting orders for everyone to remain seated. Jesse boarded one of the rear coaches, his blue eyes hard, leveling his pistol at the rows of frightened faces. The car smelled of coal smoke, stale sweat, and sudden, sharp fear. The passengers were a mix of civilians and soldiers. 24 unarmed Union soldiers on furlough after the Battle of Atlanta sat among the women and children. They were returning home or traveling to new assignments, their muskets stowed away or left behind, leaving them utterly defenseless. Anderson moved through the cars, his gaze locking onto the blue uniforms. He ordered the civilians to hand over their valuables. Jesse moved down the aisle, snatching pocket watches, tearing brooches from the dresses of weeping women, and emptying the wallets of businessmen who sat with their hands raised, trembling violently. But robbery was merely the prelude. Anderson wanted blood. He ordered the Union soldiers to stand up and file out of the train. Jesse watched the soldiers rise. Some were older veterans, their faces resigned. Others were young, barely older than Jesse himself, their eyes wide with panic. They were herded off the train and onto the station platform. The bushwhackers prodded them with gun barrels, kicking them when they stumbled. On the platform, Anderson lined them up in a single row. He paced back and forth in front of them, his voice rising in a scream as he berated them for the actions of the Union Army, specifically the treatment of Southern women and the death of his sisters in a Kansas City prison collapse. He demanded to know if there were any officers present. Sergeant Thomas Goodman stepped forward, hoping his rank would allow him to negotiate for his men. Anderson sneered at him and ordered him pulled from the line, not to save him but to keep him as a witness and a potential hostage for exchange. Goodman was shoved to the side, forced to watch the fate of his comrades. The remaining 23 soldiers stood shivering in the autumn chill. The guerrillas began to strip them. They pulled the blue coats from their backs, yanked the boots from their feet, and tore the shirts from their bodies, leaving the men half naked and humiliated. Jesse stood 10 feet away, his Remington heavy in his hand. He looked at the man directly in front of him, a private with a thick mustache who was muttering a prayer. The order to fire did not come as a shout, but as a ripple of movement. Anderson raised his pistol. The other bushwhackers followed suit. The volley was deafening. A wall of black powder smoke obscured the view for a split second as 23 heavy-caliber bullets struck home simultaneously. The impact was visceral. Bodies jerked backward as if yanked by invisible ropes. Chests exploded in red mist. The soldiers collapsed onto the wooden planks of the platform, some dying instantly, others writhing in agony. Jesse fired his weapon, the recoil jolting his shoulder. He saw his target crumble, a dark hole appearing in the center of the man's chest. The soldier fell face down, blood immediately pooling around his head. The silence that followed was broken only by the groans of the dying and the clicking of hammers being cocked for the second round. The massacre descended into butchery. The guerrillas walked down the line of fallen men, firing point blank into their heads to ensure death. Jesse walked up to a soldier who was gasping for air, clutching a stomach wound. He aimed his revolver at the man's temple and pulled the trigger. The man's head snapped to the side and the gasping stopped. Then the knives came out. The older bushwhackers, hardened by the savage customs of the border war, began to scalp the dead. They grabbed handfuls of hair, sawing at the scalp with dull Bowie knives, ripping the skin free with sickening tearing sounds. Jesse watched, his stomach churning briefly before the cold detachment settled back in. He saw Arch Clements, Anderson's lieutenant, carving the scalp from a young boy's head. The brutality was a lesson. The enemy was not human. They were meat to be slaughtered and desecrated. After the bodies were looted and mutilated, the gang turned their attention to the train. They uncoupled the engine from the cars and set the passenger coaches on fire. The wooden frames caught quickly, the flames licking up the sides and engulfing the interior where the robbery had taken place. They jammed the throttle of the locomotive open and sent it speeding down the track, a flaming ghost train hurtling toward Sturgeon. The depot was also torched, the smoke rising in a thick black column that could be seen for miles. Anderson, satisfied with the carnage, ordered his men to mount up. They rode out of Centralia, leaving 23 mutilated corpses baking in the sun, and a town traumatized beyond repair. They did not flee far, stopping only a few miles away at a rise in the land near Singleton's farm to feed their horses and wait. Anderson knew the smoke would draw the Union forces like moths to a flame. Major A.V.E. Johnston of the 39th Missouri Infantry arrived in Centralia later that afternoon. He commanded a force of approximately 155 mounted infantrymen. These were not seasoned cavalry, but infantry mounted on plow horses and mules, armed with single-shot Enfield muskets. When Johnston saw the bodies on the platform, some missing ears, others with their faces smashed in, he went into a rage. He swore to kill the men responsible. Ignoring the advice of the terrified townspeople who warned him of the sheer number and ferocity of the guerrillas, Johnston ordered the pursuit. He followed the wide, muddy trail left by Anderson's column, leading his men directly into the trap. Jesse and the others were waiting in a field of tall grass and scrub oak, a perfect ambush site where the terrain masked their numbers. Anderson split his force. He sent a small decoy group of 10 men to show themselves on the ridge, while the main body, including Jesse and Frank James, flanked the position, hidden in the ravines on either side. Jesse checked the percussion caps on his revolvers, ensuring they were seated firmly on the nipples. He tightened the cinch on his saddle. His heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He watched as Johnston's force appeared on the crest of the hill. The Union major made a fatal tactical error. Seeing the small group of decoys, he ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line on foot. He intended to fight a standard infantry engagement, firing volleys from a distance. He did not understand who he was fighting. By dismounting, he rendered his force immobile. By relying on muzzle loaders, he limited his men to a single shot before a lengthy reloading process. Anderson saw the Union soldiers hand their reins to the horse holders and form their line. He raised his hat, the signal for the attack. The main body of the bushwhackers surged from the ravines. They did not trot. They spurred their horses into a dead run instantly. The rebel yell erupted from 80 throats, a high-pitched, terrifying screech that merged with the thunder of hooves. Jesse leaned low over the neck of his bay, holding a revolver in each hand, the reins clutched in his teeth. The distance closed with frightening speed. Johnston's men fired one ragged volley. A few guerrillas were hit, tumbling from their saddles, but the charge did not falter. The bullets whizzed past Jesse, one nipping the fabric of his sleeve, but he did not flinch. The bushwhackers held their fire until they were within 20 yards. Then, the massacre began. They fired with a devastating rhythm, the revolvers creating a continuous rolling barrage of lead. The Union soldiers, frantically trying to reload their muskets with ramrods, were cut down where they stood. The line disintegrated instantly. Men dropped their rifles and turned to run, but they were on foot and the horses were upon them. It was no longer a battle, it was a harvest. Jesse rode directly into the scattering infantry. He saw a soldier fumbling for a pistol he did not have. Jesse extended his right arm, the barrel of his Remington mere feet from the man's face, and fired. The bullet struck the soldier in the mouth, exiting the back of his skull. Jesse wheeled his horse, the animal responding to the pressure of his knees. He saw Major Johnston attempting to mount his white horse. The officer was shouting orders that no one could hear. Jesse spurred his horse toward him. Another guerrilla fired first, but missed. Jesse closed the distance to 10 yards. He took a breath, steadied his aim despite the galloping horse, and fired. The bullet took Johnston in the head. The major fell backward, his boot catching in the stirrup for a moment before he hit the ground, dead before he landed. The command structure of the Union force was gone. The survivors fled toward the town of Centralia, but the bushwhackers were faster. The pursuit turned into a 3-mile running slaughter. Jesse and the others hunted the fleeing soldiers down like sport. They flushed them from the high grass and shot them in the back. They rode them down in the road, trampling those they did not shoot. There was no mercy. Soldiers who threw up their hands were shot in the face. Men who fell wounded were circled and finished off with bullets to the head. Jesse rode hard, his face blackened with powder smoke, his eyes stinging. He fired until his revolvers were empty, then drew fresh ones from his belt. He saw a young soldier trying to hide in a thicket of plum bushes. Jesse rode up to the edge of the brush, spotted the blue uniform, and fired twice into the mass of leaves. The rustling stopped. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the prairie, 123 Union soldiers lay dead. The bushwhackers had lost only 3 men. The field was littered with corpses for miles. The guerrillas returned to the site of the initial ambush to strip the dead. They took everything: boots, belts, trousers, weapons, and money. They moved methodically among the bodies, rolling them over to rifle through pockets. Jesse dismounted and walked through the carnage. The ground was slick with blood and trampled mud. He saw the bodies of men he had killed, stripped of their humanity, reduced to objects. He felt a strange, hollow satisfaction. He had survived. He had killed. He was one of them now. Frank James rode up to him, leading a captured horse loaded with muskets. He looked at his younger brother, seeing the change in his eyes. There was no fear left in Jesse, only a cold, hard resolve. The Centralia massacre had completed his education. He had learned that cruelty was a tool, that mercy was a weakness, and that the only law that mattered was the one written by the man with the loaded gun. Jesse wiped the grease and blood from his hands onto his trousers, remounted his horse, and joined the column as they began the ride back to their camp. The atrocities of the day, the execution of the unarmed, the mutilation of the dead, the total annihilation of the enemy, were not nightmares to him. They were the new reality. As darkness fell over Missouri, Jesse James rode into the night, a fully formed killer, leaving a trail of 146 dead men behind him as the first grim chapter of his legend. February 13th, 1866, descended upon the town of Liberty, Missouri, with a paralyzing gray cold that seemed to freeze the very marrow of the earth. The Civil War had been officially concluded for 10 months. But in the clouded hills of Clay County, the peace was nothing more than a legal fiction. The town, the county seat, sat huddled under a leaden sky that threatened snow, the brick buildings of the square looking stark and impenetrable against the winter gloom. The air was still, holding the biting frost that hardened the ruts of the wagon roads into jagged ridges of iron-hard mud. It was a Tuesday afternoon shortly after 2 o'clock, a time when the commerce of the town was sluggish, dampened by the temperature and the lingering economic depression of the Reconstruction era. The few citizens who ventured out onto the boardwalks kept their heads down, chins buried in wool scarves, hurrying from one stove-warmed interior to another, oblivious to the fact that the war they thought was over was about to ride back into their lives. From the outskirts of the town, a group of horsemen approached. They did not ride in a singular thunderous column that would draw the eye of the sheriff or the militia. Instead, they filtered into the streets in small, unassuming clusters, converging on the public square with the silent predatory instinct of a wolf pack encircling a herd. There were roughly a dozen men, perhaps 10 or 12, mounted on superior horseflesh that steamed in the frigid air. They were dressed in the heavy, rough wool of the frontier, long blue army overcoats that had seen better days, some perhaps stolen from the dead, others retained from service. They wore slouch hats pulled low over their eyes and heavy mufflers wrapped high around their necks, obscuring their faces from casual identification. To the unobservant eye, they appeared to be a squad of state militia, or perhaps a group of vigilantes returning from a patrol, a common enough sight in a region still teeming with resentment. But these men moved with a tension that belied any official business. Beneath their coats, strapped to their waists and chests, was an arsenal of percussion revolvers loaded and capped, ready for instant violence. The target of their convergence was the Clay County Savings Association, a modest but sturdy brick structure located on the northeast corner of the square. This institution was more than a repository for currency. It was a symbol of the Unionist capital that was slowly rebuilding the county while the former Confederates watched from the margins. The gang executed their plan with a discipline that was both impressive and terrifying. Two of the riders separated from the main body and rode directly up to the front entrance of the bank. They dismounted with fluid grace, tying their reins to the hitching post with slip knots designed to be released with a single jerk. They stamped the snow and frozen mud from their boots, checking the street one last time before turning to the door. The remaining members of the gang remained mounted, taking up strategic positions at the corners of the square and the mouths of the alleys. They sat silently in their saddles, their breath pluming in white clouds, their hands resting easily near the hidden grips of their pistols, establishing a perimeter of lethal force. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was quiet, warm, and mundane. The large cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a dry heat that smelled of wood smoke and dust. Greenup Bird, the head cashier of the institution, stood at a high, sloping desk, his attention focused on the columns of figures in the ledger before him. His son, William Bird, a clerk, was working nearby, organizing papers. The only other person in the room was the bank porter, who was tending to the fire. The silence was broken by the sound of the latch lifting and the door swinging open. A gust of freezing wind swept into the room, causing the papers on the desk to flutter. The two men who entered did not remove their hats. They walked across the floorboards with heavy, deliberate steps, the spurs on their boots chiming softly. Greenup Bird looked up, expecting to greet a customer, perhaps a farmer seeking a loan for the spring planting. Instead, he found himself staring into the black bore of a massive .44 caliber revolver. The leader of the pair, a man with cold eyes and a voice like grinding gravel, did not offer a greeting. He vaulted over the counter with a sudden, athletic violence that shattered the quiet of the room. He shoved the barrel of the heavy pistol hard into Greenup Bird's ribs, the steel digging painfully into the cashier's vest. He demanded every dollar in the bank. The shock of the moment was absolute. Bank robbery in broad daylight was an alien concept in 1866. It was something that simply did not happen in the United States during peacetime. The cashier hesitated, his mind struggling to process the intrusion of battlefield violence into his place of business. The outlaw did not tolerate the hesitation. He shoved Bird backward against the wall, cursing him, warning him that he would blow his brains out if he did not move faster. The second robber drew his weapon and leveled it at William Bird and the porter, ordering them to freeze and keeping them under the constant threat of death. The leader produced a coarse, dirty wheat sack, a common feed bag likely stolen from a barn on the ride in, and threw it at the cashier. He ordered Bird to open the vault. Greenup Bird, his hands trembling uncontrollably, fumbled with the keys. He unlocked the heavy iron door of the vault, revealing the shelves stacked with the accumulated wealth of Clay County. The robbers fell upon the money with a frantic, greedy energy. They began to sweep the contents of the vault into the wheat sack. They grabbed stacks of United States greenbacks, bundles of banknotes and heavy canvas, bags filled with gold and silver specie. They took $72,000 in 730 bonds, government securities that represented a fortune. They shoveled in $45,000 in currency. The sheer weight of the metal coin was immense. As they lifted the sack, the fabric strained. In their haste and greed, the sack became unmanageable. They dropped it, or perhaps realized they could not carry it all, and a significant amount of the heavy gold and silver coin spilled or was left behind on the floor. They prioritized the high-value paper, the bonds and the notes, stuffing the sack until it was a bulging, awkward mass. While the robbery was unfolding inside the heated bank, the situation on the frozen square was deteriorating. The presence of the mounted men, silent and watchful, had begun to draw the attention of the townspeople. Two local men, oblivious to the crime in progress, walked along the sidewalk near the bank. One of the mounted sentries, seeing them approach the door, spurred his horse onto the boardwalk. The animal's hooves clattered loudly on the wood. The outlaw drew his revolver and shoved it into the faces of the pedestrians, ordering them to turn back or die. The men, terrified by the sudden aggression, retreated hastily. But the interaction had broken the spell. A shout went up. A face appeared in a window. The realization that something was wrong rippled through the square. Inside, the robbers heard the commotion. They knew their time was evaporating. They grabbed the heavy wheat sack, now containing a king's ransom. They seized Greenup Bird and his son, dragging them toward the door. The plan was to use them as human shields to prevent the citizens from firing on them as they exited. They kicked the door open and shoved the two bankers out onto the sidewalk. The cold air hit them like a physical blow. The robbers scanned the street, seeing the confusion beginning to coalesce into alarm. Deciding that the shields were slowing them down, they shoved the Birds back into the bank lobby and slammed the door shut, trapping them inside. The two men scrambled for their horses. The wheat sack was incredibly heavy. They heaved it up, struggling to get it over the pommel of the saddle. One man held it in place while he mounted, the horse dancing nervously under the shifting weight and the tension of the rider. The gang began to coalesce, the sentries leaving their posts to join the main group. The town was waking up. Men were shouting from the storefronts. The first few brave souls were stepping out into the snow, looking for weapons. The gang did not flee immediately in a panic. They chose to assert their dominance through terror. The order was given, likely by the vicious Arch Clements or perhaps Jesse himself, to hurrah the town. The gang spurred their horses into a wild gallop. They did not ride away from the town. They rode through it. They circled the square, their horses slipping and sliding on the icy mud. They unleashed a storm of lead. Every man drew his revolvers and began to fire indiscriminately. They fired into the air, the sharp cracks of the pistols echoing like a cannonade off the brick facades. They fired through the plate glass windows of the stores, sending shards of glass flying onto the merchandise and the people cowering inside. They screamed the rebel yell, that high, terrifying shriek that had frozen the blood of Union soldiers on 100 battlefields. The square transformed instantly into a kill zone. The air was filled with the smell of black powder smoke, which hung low in the cold dampness. The citizens of Liberty dove for cover. Men threw themselves behind water troughs and rain barrels. Women pulled their children into the recesses of doorways. The gang owned the street. They were demonstrating that the law was powerless against them, that they could take what they wanted and destroy anyone who stood in their way. It was a display of pure, unadulterated anarchy. George Wymore stood on the periphery of this nightmare. He was 19 years old, a student at William Jewell College. He was a young man with a future, a student of books and ideas, far removed from the violent trade of the men riding in the street. He was standing on the opposite side of the square near the Greenhouse Hotel. He was unarmed. He was not a lawman, nor was he a vigilante. He was simply a bystander, perhaps frozen by the spectacle, or perhaps waiting for a friend. He wore a heavy coat against the chill, his breath steaming in the air. He watched the riders with a mix of confusion and horror, trying to comprehend the sudden eruption of war in his quiet college town. As the gang wheeled their horses to make their final exit, heading toward the South Road, one of the riders turned his attention to the student. There was absolutely no tactical reason for what happened next. Wymore was not blocking their path. He was not raising a weapon. He was not shouting a warning. He was merely a figure in the landscape, a representative of the civilian world that the bushwhackers despised. The rider, his face shadowed by his hat, raised his heavy revolver. He extended his arm, steadying the weapon against the motion of the horse. He took a brief, casual aim at the young man standing in the snow. The hammer fell. The percussion cap ignited the powder charge. The gun roared, a distinct sound amidst the cacophony. The heavy lead bullet tore through the winter air. It struck George Wymore directly in the chest. The impact was massive. It knocked the 19-year-old backward as if he had been shoved by a giant hand. He crumpled into the frozen mud and the light dusting of snow. The blood began to pump immediately from the wound, a bright, shocking crimson that stood out vividly against the white and gray of the street. Wymore did not scream. He did not have time. The light faded from his eyes in seconds. He lay there, his books or his errands forgotten, sacrificed to the ego and the cruelty of the James Younger gang. The shooter did not pause to check his work. He did not show remorse. He likely laughed or shouted a curse, caught up in the adrenaline of the murder. The gang thundered out of the square, their horses kicking up clods of frozen earth, leaving the town of Liberty shattered and bleeding. They rode south, firing a few final parting shots to keep the heads of the citizens down. The raid had taken less than 15 minutes. In that quarter of an hour, they had stolen a fortune and extinguished a life. The aftermath in the square was a scene of shock and grief. As the sound of the hooves faded into the distance, the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. They ran to the side of George Wymore. Men knelt in the slush, trying to find a pulse, but there was none. The student was dead. His body was lifted and carried into the hotel, a somber procession that marked the end of the town's innocence. The bank employees, Greenup and William Byrd, stumbled out of the looted building pale and shaking, announcing the magnitude of the theft to the gathering crowd. The vault was empty. The savings of the county were gone. A posse was hastily formed. The sheriff and a group of angry citizens grabbed shotguns and rifles from their homes and businesses. They mounted whatever horses were available and set out in pursuit. But the gang had a significant head start, and the weather was turning against the law. The gray sky finally opened up and the snow began to fall in earnest. It was a heavy, wet snow that blanketed the roads and the fields, filling in the hoofprints of the outlaws and obscuring their trail. The gang rode hard for the Missouri River, aiming for the Blue Mills ferry crossing. They carried the heavy wheat sack of money like a talisman. They reached the riverbank only to find a new obstacle. The river was choked with ice. Jagged cakes of frozen water churned in the dark current, making a crossing by boat impossible. They were trapped on the north side of the river with a posse forming behind them. Panic briefly threatened the cohesion of the group. They turned west, riding along the bluffs, searching for a place to hide or a way across. Realizing that a large group moving together was too easy to track, they made the decision to split up. They found a secluded spot in the timber to examine the loot. They realized quickly that the $72,000 in government bonds were useless to them. These were registered securities, traceable and impossible to sell without alerting the authorities. In a fit of frustration or perhaps calculation, they abandoned the bonds, leaving a fortune in paper to rot or be recovered. They kept the $45,000 in currency, dividing it among themselves. The gang dispersed into the rugged terrain of the river bottoms. The heavy snow continued to fall, wiping the slate of the landscape clean. The posse from Liberty, cold, tired, and blinded by the storm, lost the trail completely. They were forced to turn back, defeated by the elements and the superior horsemanship of the raiders. The gang slipped away into the white void, vanishing into the network of safe houses and sympathetic farms that would shelter them for the next decade and a half. The Liberty Bank robbery was a defining event, not just for the town but for the nation. It marked the transition of the bushwhacker from a political soldier to a criminal predator. The killing of George Y. Moore was the pivotal moment in that transition. During the war, violence was rationalized as a necessity of combat. The shooting of Y. Moore was different. It was a murder committed for the sheer sake of violence, an act of terrorism designed to instill fear in the civilian population. It proved that the men who rode under the leadership of Arch Clements and Jesse James were not Robin Hoods redistributing wealth. They were killers who viewed the lives of innocents as collateral damage. As the town of Liberty buried George Y. Moore in the frozen ground, the reality of what had happened settled over the community. The war was over, but the killing had not stopped. A new kind of war had begun, one fought for profit and ego. The image of the student dying in the snow would haunt the region for years, a stark reminder that the men who claimed to be defending the Southern honor were, in truth, its greatest stain. The wheat sack full of money would eventually be spent on whiskey, cards, and more guns, but the blood on the square would remain a permanent indictment of the James Younger gang. The era of the outlaw had officially begun, inaugurated with the theft of thousands and the murder of a boy who simply happened to be walking in the snow. March 20th, 1868 arrived in Russellville, Kentucky, with the crisp, damp promise of early spring. The town, a prosperous hub in Logan County, sat nestled in the southern part of the state, far removed from the border warfare that had ravaged Missouri. It was a place of relative tranquility, where the Civil War was a fading memory rather than a daily reality. The streets were lined with budding trees and the brick storefronts spoke of commerce and stability. For weeks, the town had hosted a group of strangers who presented themselves as cattle buyers and horse traders. These men, polite and well-dressed, had integrated themselves into the local rhythm. They frequented the saloons, discussed livestock prices with the local farmers, and paid for their meals with crisp banknotes. Among them was a man calling himself Mr. Colburn, a figure of striking charisma with blinking blue eyes and a quiet intensity. This was Jesse Woodson James, and he was not there to buy cattle. He was meticulously surveying the architecture and security of the Nimrod Long Banking Company. The morning of the raid began with a deceptive normalcy. The sun climbed into a clear sky, warming the air and drying the mud on the main thoroughfares. At approximately 10 o'clock, the trap snapped shut. 5 men rode into town, their movements coordinated and precise. They did not ride in a single group to avoid suspicion, but converged on the bank from different angles. They wore heavy coats despite the mild weather, concealing the multiple revolvers that were the tools of their trade. These were the same men who had ridden through the blood at Centralia and the snow at Liberty, but they had refined their tactics. They were no longer just bushwhackers. They were professional criminals operating with military discipline. 2 of the riders stopped their horses directly in front of the bank. 3 others took up positions in the street, their eyes scanning the windows and alleyways, acting as a rearguard to secure the escape route. The Nimrod Long Banking Company was situated in a sturdy brick building projecting an image of impregnable financial security. Inside, the air smelled of paper, ink, and polished wood. Nimrod Long, the bank president, was present that morning. He was a man of significant standing in the community, known for his shrewd business sense and his resilience. He stood near the rear of the bank, conversing with a local farmer named Simmons. The bank clerk, Hugh Barkley, was behind the counter, organizing stacks of currency and updating the ledgers. The atmosphere was quiet, disturbed only by the scratching of pens and the low murmur of conversation. The peace shattered instantly when the front door swung open and two men strode in with weapons drawn. Jesse James and his companion, likely Cole Younger, entered the bank with the force of a battering ram. They did not shout immediately, but moved with a terrifying speed that bridged the gap between the door and the counter in seconds. Jesse leveled a heavy-caliber revolver at Hugh Barkley. The muzzle of the gun looked enormous to the young clerk. Jesse's voice was flat and hard as he demanded the keys to the vault. Barkley, paralyzed by the sudden intrusion of violence into his mundane workday, stood frozen. He stared at the weapon, his mind unable to process the command. Jesse did not repeat himself. He vaulted over the counter, his boots hitting the floorboards with a heavy thud, and shoved the pistol into Barkley's face. The physical contact broke the clerk's paralysis, and he raised his hands, stammering that the vault was already unlocked. Nimrod Long, standing in the rear of the room, realized instantly what was happening. He was not a man to submit easily. Unlike the terrified clerks in Liberty, Long possessed a defiant streak. He saw the intruders and made a split-second decision to resist. He turned and ran toward the back door of the bank, intending to escape and raise the alarm. Jesse saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. The outlaw's reaction was instinctive, honed by years of shooting fleeing men in the back. He spun away from the clerk, bringing his revolver to bear on the running banker. He did not hesitate to verify the target or consider the consequences. He simply fired. The gunshot roared in the confined space of the bank, a deafening explosion that rang in the ears of everyone present. The bullet tore through the air, missing Long's spine by a fraction of an inch. It struck the banker in the back of the head, grazing his skull. The impact was violent, tearing through the scalp and concussing him, but the angle was shallow enough that the lead did not penetrate the brain. Long stumbled, the force of the blow knocking his equilibrium off balance, but adrenaline surged through his system. He did not fall. Blood began to pour from the wound, streaming down his neck and soaking into his collar, but he kept moving. He threw himself against the rear door, burst through it into the alleyway, and continued running, shouting for help at the top of his lungs. Jesse, realizing his shot had failed to kill, cursed but did not pursue. The priority was the money. He turned his attention back to the vault and the terrified clerk. The interior of the bank was now filled with the acrid stench of black powder smoke which hung in the air like a blue-gray fog. Jesse and Cole Younger began to loot the bank with frantic efficiency. They grabbed canvas sacks and began to sweep the contents of the safe into them. They took stacks of United States Treasury notes, bundles of banknotes, and bags of gold and silver coin. The coins clinked heavily, a sound that underscored the theft. They gathered approximately $9,000 in currency and coin, though some reports would later inflate the number to $14,000. It was a massive haul representing the life savings of the Russellville community. While the robbery unfolded inside, the situation outside was deteriorating rapidly. The citizens of Russellville, alerted by Nimrod Long's shouts and the sound of the gunshot, began to react. Men emerged from stores and houses, grasping the reality of the situation. The three outlaws stationed in the street saw the town waking up. They did not panic. They initiated a suppression tactic known as hurrahing. They spurred their horses into a gallop, riding up and down the street, firing their revolvers wildly. They aimed at windows, at the ground, and into the air, creating a wall of noise and lead designed to terrify the populace into inaction. The heavy reports of the dragoon pistols echoed off the brick buildings, creating the illusion of a much larger force. A local citizen, a man named Mr. Owens, made the mistake of stepping out of a store to investigate the commotion. One of the riders, possibly George Shepard, saw him. The outlaw leveled his pistol and fired a warning shot that struck the door frame inches from Owens' head, sending splinters of wood flying into his face. Owens retreated instantly, diving back into the safety of the shop. The street was effectively cleared. The outlaws controlled the environment through the projection of absolute lethality. They screamed threats, daring anyone to show their face. The psychological impact was as potent as the gunfire. The townspeople realized they were dealing with men who would kill them as casually as they would shoot a stray dog. Back inside the bank, Jesse and Cole finished their work. The wheat sacks were heavy with loot. They dragged the money to the front door, ignoring the terrified Barkley who was cowering behind the counter. They burst out onto the sidewalk, the bright sunlight contrasting sharply with the dim, smoke-filled interior. The rear guard saw them emerge and brought fresh horses over. Jesse threw the heavy sack over his saddle horn. The horse shied at the weight and the smell of the powder smoke, dancing nervously on the hard-packed dirt. Jesse mounted with a fluid motion, controlling the animal with an iron grip on the reins. Nimrod Long, despite his head wound and the blood loss, had managed to retrieve a pistol from a nearby merchant. He emerged from the alleyway, determined to fight back. He saw the outlaws mounting their horses. Long raised his weapon, his hand shaking from the shock of his injury, and fired a shot at the retreating gang. The bullet whistled harmlessly past the riders. Jesse turned in his saddle, his face a mask of cold fury. He raised his revolver for a second shot at the banker, but the distance was opening up and the horse was moving too erratically. He held his fire, saving the ammunition for the escape. The gang coalesced into a tight formation and thundered out of town, their horses kicking up clods of mud and dust. The escape from Russellville was a display of superior horsemanship and tactical planning. The gang rode hard to the north, heading toward the dense timberlands that would offer them cover. They did not ride blindly. They had scouted the routes weeks in advance, knowing exactly where the creeks could be forded and where the trails intersected. They pushed their horses to a gallop, maintaining a punishing pace for miles to put distance between themselves and any potential pursuit. The landscape flew by, a blur of trees and fences. They rode in silence, the only sounds the pounding of hooves and the heavy breathing of the animals. Behind them, Russellville was in chaos. Nimrod Long was attended to by a local physician. The doctor cleaned the wound, shaving the hair around the gash in his scalp. The bullet had furrowed the bone but had not cracked it. Long was lucky to be alive. A fraction of an inch to the right, and he would have been a corpse on the floor of his own bank. The town sheriff hastily organized a posse, gathering men who were willing to ride. They armed themselves with rifles and shotguns, fueled by anger and the desire for justice. They rode out within the hour, following the clear tracks left by the fleeing outlaws. The gang, however, had anticipated the pursuit. After 10 miles, they began to employ evasive maneuvers. They rode into a creek bed, letting the water wash away their scent and hide their hoofprints. They followed the stream for a mile before emerging on rocky ground where their passage would leave little trace. They split up briefly, riding in pairs through the woods before rendezvousing at a pre-arranged location. This confusion tactic slowed the posse significantly. The pursuers found themselves stopping constantly to regain the trail, debating which set of tracks to follow. By nightfall, the gang had vanished into the darkness of the Kentucky countryside. The Russellville robbery marked a significant evolution in the career of Jesse James. It demonstrated that the gang was no longer confined to the borders of Missouri. They were capable of projecting their power into neighboring states, striking targets hundreds of miles from their home turf. The raid also reinforced the ruthless nature of their operations. The shooting of Nimrod Long was a pivotal moment. Unlike the accidental shooting of a bystander or a chaotic firefight with soldiers, this was the attempted execution of a compliant victim who simply tried to flee. Jesse had shot an unarmed man in the back of the head at close range. The intent was murder, pure and simple. The fact that Long survived was a matter of ballistics and luck, not mercy. As the gang camped that night deep in the woods, counting their stolen thousands by the light of a shielded fire, the reality of their existence was stark. They were predators. The romantic notion of the rebel guerrilla fighting for a lost cause was a thin veil covering the face of greed and violence. They had terrified a town, nearly killed a community leader, and stolen the wealth of hard-working families. Jesse sat by the fire cleaning his revolver. He wiped the soot from the cylinder and the barrel, inspecting the mechanism with obsessive care. His face showed no remorse for the violence of the day. The injury to Long was merely a tactical detail, a variable in the equation of the robbery. The news of the Russellville raid spread across the country via telegraph. Newspapers carried the story of the daring daylight robbery and the vicious assault on the bank president. The descriptions of the Colburn character matched Jesse James perfectly. The law enforcement agencies in Kentucky and Missouri began to communicate, piecing together the movements of the gang. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a private security firm with a growing reputation, took note of the crime. The net was beginning to tighten, but the holes were still wide enough for the James brothers to slip through. Back in Russellville, the town began the slow process of recovery. Nimrod Long, his head bandaged, returned to work within days, a living testament to the gang's brutality. The bank reopened, but the sense of security was gone. The people of Russellville had witnessed the face of the new American outlaw. Disciplined, heavily armed, and utterly without conscience. They told the story to anyone who would listen, describing the cold blue eyes of the leader and the thunder of the hooves. The legend grew, fueled by the fear the gang left in their wake. For Jesse, the money from Russellville meant survival and continued freedom. It bought him time, anonymity, and the loyalty of his network. He returned to Missouri quietly, slipping back into the guise of a farmer or a traveler. He visited his mother, Zerelda, at the farm in Kearney, bringing with him the spoils of his war on society. The violence he had inflicted in Kentucky was left behind, a problem for the people of Russellville to deal with. He was already thinking ahead, calculating the next target, the next town that would unknowingly play host to the specter of death. The assault on Nimrod Long was not an aberration, it was a confirmation of his methodology. Resistance would be met with immediate lethal force. This was the rule of the gun, and Jesse James was its most devoted practitioner. The psychological impact on the gang members was cumulative. With each robbery, the threshold for violence lowered. The hesitation that might have existed in the early days was gone. They were comfortable with the weight of the gold and the weight of the guilt, if indeed they felt any. The camaraderie of the campfire, the shared danger, and the shared spoils bound them together tighter than any family. They were a wolf pack, and the Midwest was their hunting ground. The Russellville robbery was a successful hunt, yielding ample meat for the pack, and they feasted on the proceeds while the law floundered in their wake. As the weeks passed, the spring rains washed away the tracks leading out of Russellville. But the memory of the violence remained etched in the minds of the witnesses. The bullet scar on Nimrod Long's head served as a permanent reminder of the day the James gang came to Kentucky. For Jesse, it was just another day of work, another step on the road that would lead him deeper into infamy and further away from any hope of redemption. The man who had ridden into town as a polite cattle buyer had ridden out as a demon, leaving a trail of terror that would pave the way for the tragedies yet to come. The mask of the Robin Hood was slipping, revealing the cold, dead eyes of the killer beneath. And the country was beginning to see the true nature of the man they called Jesse James. December 7th, 1869, settled over the rugged hills of Davis County, Missouri, with a suffocating gray heaviness that promised snow before nightfall. The town of Gallatin, the county seat, lay quiet under the oppressive winter sky, its streets frozen into hard ridges of mud and ice that crunched loudly under the wheels of passing wagons. It was a Tuesday, shortly after the noon hour, and the rhythm of the community had slowed for the midday meal. Smoke curled lazily from brick chimneys, drifting horizontally on a biting wind that cut through wool coats and numbed exposed skin. Into this frozen tableau rode two strangers, their presence marking the beginning of a tragedy that would irrevocably alter the history of the American West. They approached the town not with the thunder of a raiding party, but with the calculated stealth of predators entering a grazing herd. They rode fine, high-spirited horses, a sleek, muscular bay mare and a powerful sorrel gelding that pranced nervously on the slick ground, their breath venting in thick white plumes against the drab background of the dormant landscape. The riders were heavily armed, though their arsenal was carefully concealed beneath long, heavy coats buttoned tight to their chins. One man, Frank James, rode with a slouching ease, his eyes constantly moving, scanning the roof lines, the alley mouths, and the few pedestrians braving the cold. He was the anchor, the cool calculator of risks. The other rider, his younger brother Jesse James, radiated a vibrating, restless energy. His pale face was set in a grim line, and his blinking blue eyes darted frantically, burning with an intensity that went beyond the simple adrenaline of a heist. They were not merely looking for gold. Jesse was looking for a ghost. He carried a hatred in his gut that had festered for 5 years, a corrosive desire for vengeance against the Union officer Samuel P. Cox, the man credited with the ambush and killing of their guerrilla mentor, Bloody Bill Anderson. Jesse had received intelligence that Cox was living in Gallatin, and in his mind, the line between robbery and assassination had blurred into a single bloody objective. They tied their horses to the hitching rail in front of the Daviess County Savings Association, a modest one-story brick structure that projected an image of stability and security. The brothers checked the cinches on their saddles, ensuring they were tight enough for a hard ride but loose enough to allow the animals to breathe during a gallop. They adjusted the heavy Navy Colt revolvers at their waists, feeling the cold, reassuring weight of the iron against their hips. With a final glance at the desolate street, they pushed through the front door of the bank. The bell above the entrance jingled cheerfully, a sharp, metallic sound that contrasted with the grim intent of the men entering. A gust of freezing wind followed them inside, causing the flames in the pot-bellied stove to dance and flare. Inside, the bank was warm and smelled of dry paper ink and the faint metallic scent of copper pennies. The interior was small, dominated by a wooden counter that separated the public area from the secure zone where the safe and the ledgers were kept. Captain John W. Sheets, the 30-year-old cashier and principal officer of the bank, sat at a desk behind the partition. Sheets was a pillar of the Gallatin community, a respected businessman and a veteran who had served as a captain in the Union militia during the war. He was a man of peace now, focused on the mundane details of finance. Beside him, the clerk, William McDowell, was busy organizing receipts and updating the daily ledger, his pen scratching rhythmically across the paper. The arrival of the two strangers caused both men to look up. Sheets rose from his chair, his expression polite and professional, expecting a standard transaction. Jesse James walked to the counter, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. He stared at John Sheets with a fixed, unblinking gaze. In the dim light of the bank, a fatal case of mistaken identity began to unfold in the outlaw's mind. Sheets bore a passing resemblance to Samuel Cox, the target of Jesse's obsession. The years of violence, the trauma of the war, and the constant paranoia had warped Jesse's perception. He did not see a cashier. He saw the executioner of Bloody Bill. He saw the enemy. Jesse reached into his coat pocket not for a weapon yet, but for a $100 banknote. He placed the bill on the counter, smoothing it out with a gloved hand, and asked Sheets to change it. The request was a tactical diversion, a way to force the banker to open the safe or the cash drawer and to lower his guard while Jesse confirmed his target. Sheets picked up the bill, inspecting it for the telltale signs of a counterfeit. Satisfied, he turned to the safe, retrieved a stack of smaller currency, and began to count it out on the desk. He took a pen and began to write out a receipt for the transaction, his head bowed, his neck exposed. The room was silent save for the scratching of the pen and the wind whistling outside the window. Jesse watched him, his hand drifting slowly toward the flap of his holster. The decision was made. There would be no robbery in the traditional sense. This was to be a killing. As Sheets finished writing and looked up to hand the receipt to the customer, he found himself staring into the muzzle of a .44 caliber revolver. The bore of the weapon looked like a dark tunnel. Jesse did not demand the money. He did not shout for the clerk to raise his hands. He spoke with a terrifying, quiet calm, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. He accused Sheets of being the man who killed Bill Anderson. Sheets, confused and suddenly terrified, began to stammer a denial, his mind struggling to comprehend the accusation. He backed away, his hands raising instinctively in a futile gesture of defense, his eyes wide with the realization of his impending death. Jesse pulled the trigger. The hammer fell, igniting the percussion cap, and the main charge of black powder exploded with a deafening roar that shook the window panes. The heavy lead ball struck John Sheets directly in the head, entering near the forehead and crashing through his brain. The impact was violent and immediate. Sheets was hurled backward by the force of the shot, his body going limp instantly. He collapsed to the floor behind the counter, blood immediately pooling around his head, staining the wooden planks a bright, shocking crimson. He died without a scream, executed for a crime he did not commit by a man who did not care to verify the truth. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled the small room instantly, choking the air with the scent of violence. William McDowell, the clerk, stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his mind paralyzed by the sudden eruption of gunfire. He looked at the body of his employer, then at the smoking gun in Jesse's hand. Survival instinct took over. McDowell lunged for the side door, desperate to put a wall between himself and the killers. Frank James, who had been guarding the entrance, saw the movement. He raised his own revolver and fired at the fleeing clerk. The bullet missed McDowell by inches, slamming into the doorframe and sending sharp splinters of wood flying into the air. McDowell scrambled through the door and burst out onto the sidewalk, screaming for help at the top of his lungs. His cries shattered the quiet of the winter afternoon, alerting the entire town that the bank was under attack. Inside the bank, Jesse ignored the fleeing clerk. He did not even look at the money on the counter. He stepped around the partition, his boots sliding in the spreading pool of blood, and grabbed the bank's portfolio, a leather case he believed contained the bank's bonds and large notes. In reality, it held only business papers of little value. The brothers had secured nothing of financial worth. The murder was the only currency they had earned. Jesse turned and ran for the door, joining Frank. They burst out onto the street, weapons drawn, their eyes wild. The town was waking up. Men were shouting, doors were slamming, and the first few armed citizens were running toward the square. The escape turned into a chaotic disaster. The brothers ran to their horses. Frank untied his sorrel and swung into the saddle with the grace of a practiced cavalryman, keeping his revolver trained on the gathering crowd to suppress their advance. Jesse ran to his bay mare. The horse, high-strung and terrified by the gunshot and the shouting, was dancing wildly, its eyes rolling in panic. Jesse grabbed the pommel and attempted to mount. He shoved his left boot into the stirrup, but as he tried to swing his right leg over, the horse lunged forward with explosive force. Jesse lost his grip on the saddle horn. He fell backward, but his left foot remained, trapped in the iron stirrup. The mare bolted, dragging the notorious outlaw through the frozen mud and ice of the street. Jesse was battered against the hard ground, his body twisting helplessly as the terrified animal galloped 30 feet. His head and shoulders struck the earth repeatedly. He frantically kicked at the stirrup, trying to free himself, while the horse's hooves churned the dirt inches from his face. Frank saw his brother's peril. He spurred his sorrel after the runaway mare, ignoring the danger of the armed townsmen who were now taking aim. He managed to grab the reins of Jesse's horse and haul the beast to a halt. Jesse extricated his bruised foot from the stirrup, his clothes torn, his coat covered in filth, his body aching from the impacts. The delay was catastrophic. The element of surprise was gone, and the citizens of Gallatin were opening fire. Bullets whizzed through the air, striking the brick walls of the bank and kicking up spurts of dirt around the outlaws. Jesse, realizing his horse was too panicked to ride and that the girth had loosened during the struggle, abandoned the animal. He turned to Frank. "Wait for me!" he shouted. Frank extended a hand, and Jesse swung up behind him on the sorrel. The two brothers rode double, the single horse laboring under the weight of two grown men and their heavy weaponry. They galloped out of town, leaving the bay mare and the evidence it represented behind them. They rode south, the horse heaving and blowing, its pace significantly slower than if they were mounted individually. They needed a second horse immediately. A few miles outside of town, they encountered a local man named Daniel Smoot who was riding a quality mount toward Gallatin. The brothers, desperate and dangerous, reined in their overburdened horse and leveled their smoking pistols at Smoot. They ordered him to dismount. Smoot, seeing the wild, mud-streaked faces of the outlaws and the murderous intent in their eyes, complied instantly. He slid off his horse, backing away with his hands raised. Jesse slid off the back of Frank's horse and vaulted onto Smoot's animal. He adjusted the stirrups quickly. "We're much obliged," one of them sneered, a dark humor surfacing even in the midst of their flight. Now, with fresh mounts, they spurred their horses into a full run. The chase was on. Back in Gallatin, a posse was forming with remarkable speed. Captain John Thomason, a resident of the town and a man of considerable grit, grabbed his repeating rifle and mounted his best horse. He was joined by his son and several other determined citizens. They rode hard after the outlaws, tracking them by the deep hoof prints in the soft earth. Thomason, a skilled rider, managed to close the distance. He spotted the brothers ahead of him on the road, silhouetted against the gray sky. Thomason raised his rifle, aiming for the riders. He fired. The bullet sang through the air and struck the horse Jesse was riding, Smoot's stolen mount, in the flank. The animal screamed a high-pitched sound of pain but kept running, driven by the adrenaline and the cruel spurs of the outlaw. The brothers turned in their saddles and returned fire, their revolvers popping like firecrackers. The bullets whistled past Thomason, forcing him to pull back and keep his distance. The running gunfight continued for miles, a chaotic exchange of lead across the rolling Missouri landscape. The outlaws utilized their superior knowledge of the terrain, veering off the main road and jumping fences to break their trail. They rode into the heavy timber along the Grand River, where the shadows and the dense undergrowth provided cover. The ground was rough, covered in fallen logs and thick brush. They pushed the horses mercilessly, sliding down ravines and scrambling up steep banks. The sun began to set, casting the woods into deep darkness. The posse, their horses blown and the light failing, was eventually forced to abandon the chase. The James brothers had escaped, vanishing into the gloom of the forest, but the cost of the day was higher than they realized. Back in Gallatin, the town was in an uproar. The body of John Sheets was carried from the bank, a tragic victim of a war that refused to end. The community was in shock, their anger boiling over into a demand for justice. But the most damning piece of evidence was standing in the street, shivering in the cold. The bay mare that Jesse had failed to mount was taken into custody by the sheriff. It was not an anonymous beast. Investigators examined the animal and quickly traced its ownership. The horse had been sold recently, and the trail of the sale led directly back to the James farm in Kearney. It was the property of Jesse James. For the first time in their criminal career, there was undeniable physical proof linking the brothers to a robbery and a murder. Before Gallatin, the raids at Liberty and Russellville had been attributed to a vague group of former bushwhackers. The authorities suspected the James boys, but they had no concrete evidence to swear out a warrant. Now the mask was ripped away. The state of Missouri and the nation knew exactly who was responsible. The headlines would scream the names of Jesse and Frank James. The killing of Captain Sheets was not seen as a daring raid. It was viewed as a savage, cowardly act of assassination. Governor Thomas T. Crittenden would eventually place a massive bounty on their heads, but in 1869 the immediate reaction was a wave of public revulsion and official condemnation. The James brothers could no longer pretend to be simple farmers. They returned to their mother's farm briefly, but they knew they could not stay. The identification of the horse meant that the law would be coming to their doorstep with a warrant that bore their names. They gathered their belongings, their weapons, and their money, what little they had taken from Gallatin, and went into hiding. They became true outlaws, men who lived entirely outside the law, moving from safe house to safe house, relying on the network of Confederate sympathizers to survive. The psychological impact on Jesse was profound, though he never admitted to the mistake. He had killed a man he believed to be his enemy, only to realize later that he had murdered an innocent civilian. Yet there was no remorse. Instead, Jesse began to pen letters to the newspapers, denying his involvement and claiming he was being persecuted. He crafted a narrative of victimhood, claiming that he was being hunted by a vindictive government because of his service to the Confederacy. This propaganda campaign began in the aftermath of Gallatin. He used the incident to position himself not as a murderer, but as a political symbol, a defiant rebel who refused to be subjugated. The murder of John Sheets also marked a shift in the public perception of the gang. To a small minority, the unreconstructed rebels, they were heroes fighting the Republican administration. To the majority of law-abiding citizens, they were rabid dogs that needed to be put down. The brutality of the killing, shooting a cashier at point-blank range without provocation, stripped away the romance of the highwayman. It was a gritty, ugly reality. The blood on the floor of the Daviess County Savings Association was not the blood of a combatant. It was the blood of a working man, a father, a neighbor. As night fully descended on December 7th, the James brothers were riding through the dark woods, the cold wind biting at their faces. They were alive, but they were marked men. The Gallatin raid had been a tactical failure and a strategic disaster. They had traded their anonymity for a few worthless papers and a murder charge. The shadow of the noose now hung over them permanently. The transition was complete. They were no longer farm boys pushed into violence by war. They were career criminals, killers by trade, who would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for the bullet that would eventually find them. The Robin Hood myth was born not from their benevolence, but from the necessity to cover the stark, bloody truth of events like the murder of Captain Sheets. The reality was far simpler and far more terrifying. Jesse James was a man who would kill you for looking like someone he hated, and he would sleep soundly that same night. The chill of the Missouri winter was nothing compared to the coldness in his heart as he rode deeper into the darkness, leaving the weeping widow of John Sheets to mourn the cost of a legend built on blood. September 26, 1872, arrived in Kansas City, Missouri, with the vibrant energy of a metropolis celebrating its own rapid expansion. The occasion was the second annual Kansas City Industrial Exposition, a massive fair held on grounds located southeast of the city limits near 12th and Campbell Streets. The sky was a polished blue devoid of clouds, and the temperature was mild, creating the perfect conditions for the crowd of nearly 30,000 people who had gathered to witness the spectacle of commerce and entertainment. The fairgrounds were a sprawling complex of wooden grandstands, livestock sheds, and exhibition halls, all enclosed by a high wooden fence designed to funnel spectators through specific gates. The air was thick with the dust kicked up by thousands of boots and the scent of roasted peanuts, cigar smoke, and livestock. It was a Thursday, and the main attraction of the afternoon was the horse racing, a sport that drew gamblers and families alike to the railing of the half-mile track. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the excitement was at its peak. Ethan Allen, a famous trotting horse, was competing against a running mate, and the roar of the crowd was deafening as the animals thundered down the home stretch. All eyes were fixed on the track, leaving the perimeter of the grounds and the entrance gates largely ignored by the throngs of people. Near the main gate on the eastern side of the fairgrounds, the ticket office sat exposed. It was a small wooden structure where the day's receipts were collected and counted. Ben Wallace, the secretary of the Fair Association, was inside the booth, organizing the cash and preparing to move it to the First National Bank. The receipts for the day were substantial, a mix of silver coins and paper currency that represented the admission fees of the massive crowd. While the attention of the city was focused on the finish line, 3 horsemen rode toward the main gate. They did not approach with the speed of the wind, but with a casual, deliberate pace that allowed them to blend in with the traffic of carriages and pedestrians moving outside the fence. The men were dressed well, wearing fine suits that were perhaps slightly too heavy for the warm afternoon, concealing the weaponry strapped to their bodies. They rode superb horses, animals with the stamina and speed of thoroughbreds, yet trained to stand still amidst gunfire. The leader of the trio was Jesse James, his face obscured slightly by a hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the layout of the entrance with the cold precision of a structural engineer assessing a demolition site. Flanking him were Frank James and Robert Younger, forming a compact, lethal unit that moved with a singular purpose. The riders reached the gate just as the race ended and the cheering began to subside. They did not dismount. Instead, they spurred their horses forward, riding directly through the open gate and into the crowd of people, milling around the ticket booth. The sudden appearance of mounted men in a pedestrian area caused a ripple of confusion but not immediate panic. People stepped aside, assuming the riders were officials or perhaps part of the show. Jesse rode his horse straight up to the window of the ticket booth. The animal's shoulder brushed against the wood. Jesse leaned down, his movement fluid and threatening. He did not produce a ticket. He produced a heavy Navy revolver, the steel barrel gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside the booth, Ben Wallace looked up to see the weapon leveled at his face. The demand was short and absolute. Jesse ordered him to hand over the tin cash box. Wallace, realizing the gravity of the situation, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his instincts warring with the reality of the gun. Jesse cocked the hammer of the revolver, the mechanical click audible even over the background noise of the fair. He told Wallace that if he did not hand over the money instantly, he would be shot dead where he stood. Wallace, looking into the flat, dead eyes of the outlaw, shoved the tin box across the counter. The box contained $978, a significant sum, though far less than the tens of thousands the gang had hoped to find. Jesse grabbed the box with his left hand, balancing it on the pommel of his saddle. He signaled to his companions. The robbery had taken less than a minute. They had struck in the middle of a crowd of thousands in broad daylight with a brazen confidence that bordered on insanity. But the extraction would prove far more volatile than the insertion. As the three men turned their horses to leave, the crowd began to realize what had happened. A shout went up. "Robbery! They're robbing the box office!" The cry spread outward like a wave, turning the confusion into chaos. The outlaws spurred their horses, intending to ride out the same way they had come. However, the gate was now clogged with people entering and leaving. The path was blocked. Jesse made a split-second decision. He wheeled his horse around and headed for the exit on the south side of the grounds. To get there, they had to ride through the press of the crowd. The horses, sensing the tension and the sudden movement, became agitated. The outlaws drew their weapons, brandishing a revolver in each hand. They did not fire into the air to scare the people. They fired directly at the ground and at the legs of the crowd to clear a path. The scene descended into a nightmare. The sharp cracks of the pistols terrified the fairgoers. Men shouted and shoved women and children out of the way. The horses trampled through the panicked mob, their iron-shod hooves slipping on the grass and the gravel. Jesse rode in the lead, swinging his pistol from side to side, creating a zone of terror that forced people to scramble for safety. He fired a shot that struck the ground near a group of men who were attempting to block the path. The bullet ricocheted, kicking up dirt and sending the men diving for cover. In the midst of this stampede stood a young girl. She was a child, small and fragile in the crushing weight of the panicked adults. She had come to the fair to see the horses and the exhibits, wearing her best dress, her hand likely held by a parent or a sibling just moments before the chaos severed their connection. As the outlaws thundered past, firing their weapons to suppress any pursuit, a bullet fired by one of the gang members, likely Jesse given his position in the lead, missed its intended target of the ground or a pursuer. The heavy lead slug tore through the air and struck the girl in the leg. The impact was devastating. The bullet shattered the bone and tore through the muscle of her young limb. She collapsed instantly, her small body falling into the dirt, surrounded by the stamping boots of the fleeing crowd. She screamed, a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the roar of the panic. Blood began to soak her stocking and the hem of her dress, turning the white fabric a deep, terrifying red. She lay there, a victim of a war she did not understand. Struck down by men who claimed to be fighting for a cause but were now simply fighting for a tin box of cash. The gang did not stop. They did not look back. They cleared the perimeter of the crowd and reached the open ground beyond the fair. They spurred their horses into a full gallop, heading south into the woods, the stolen money rattling in the tin box. Behind them, the fairgrounds were in pandemonium. The joy of the afternoon had been obliterated. The race was forgotten. People gathered around the fallen girl, their faces pale with shock. A doctor was shouted for, and men with grim expressions lifted the child from the dust, her leg hanging at a sickening angle. The news of the robbery and the shooting spread through Kansas City with the speed of a telegraph signal. The audacity of the crime was shocking. To rob a fair in front of 30,000 people was an act of dominance, a statement that the law could not protect the citizens even when they were gathered in mass. But the shooting of the girl changed the narrative. Until this moment, many in Missouri had clung to the romanticized image of the James Younger gang. They were seen by some as folk heroes, Confederates who were redistributing the wealth of the Yankee banks. The shooting of a child shattered that illusion for many. There was no heroism in maiming a little girl. There was no political statement in firing blindly into a crowd of families. The gang rode hard, putting miles between themselves and the city. They crossed the Blue River, letting the water wash away their trail. They rode into the deep timber of Jackson County, a landscape they knew better than any sheriff. They eventually stopped to divide the loot. They pried open the tin box, $978. It was a paltry sum for the risk they had taken and the violence they had inflicted. They split the money, shoving the bills and coins into their pockets. Jesse looked at the empty box and tossed it into the underbrush. He was agitated, his mind racing not with guilt but with the management of his public image. Jesse James was a man obsessed with his own legend. He read the newspapers religiously, tracking the way his crimes were reported. He knew that shooting a child would be a public relations disaster. It would alienate the very people who provided him with shelter and silence. In the days following the robbery, while hiding in a safe house, Jesse took a pen and paper and wrote a letter to the Kansas City Times. This was a tactic he would use repeatedly, controlling the narrative through the press. In the letter, Jesse denied that he or his brother were involved in the robbery. He claimed that they were being accused falsely by a vindictive press and a corrupt government. But then, in a twist of twisted logic that revealed his desperate need for validation, he offered to pay for the medical care of the injured girl. He stated that even though he did not commit the crime, he was so moved by the tragedy that he would provide funds for her recovery if the true perpetrators were not caught. It was a calculated, cynical move. He was trying to buy back the public's favor with the very money he had likely stolen, or at least with the proceeds of other crimes. He wanted to be seen as a benevolent protector, even as he was the architect of the violence. The letter was published, and it sparked a fierce debate. Some believed him, desperate to keep their hero pure. Others saw it for what it was, the manipulation of a sociopath. But the reality remained unchanged. A little girl was maimed for life. She would walk with a limp if she walked at all, bearing the scar of the James gang's greed forever. The physical detail of her injury, the shattered bone, the long, painful recovery, the infection risks common in 19th century medicine, was the gritty truth that no letter could erase. The robbery at the Kansas City Fair also marked a tactical escalation. The gang was no longer hitting isolated banks in small towns. They were striking at the heart of the major cities in the middle of broad daylight. It showed a lack of fear that was terrifying to the authorities. It proved that they could strike anywhere, at any time. The police in Kansas City were humiliated. They had been present at the fair, yet they had been powerless to stop the three riders. The investigation that followed was frantic but fruitless. The gang had vanished into the network of sympathizers that crisscrossed the state. However, the internal dynamic of the gang began to shift. The sheer recklessness of the fair robbery suggested that Jesse was becoming addicted to the adrenaline and the notoriety. He was taking risks that were disproportionate to the reward. Frank James, the more cautious of the two, likely argued against such exposure. But Jesse's will was dominant. The shooting of the girl also added a weight to their souls. These men were killers, yes, but they considered themselves soldiers. Shooting a child was not the act of a soldier, it was the act of a brigand. It was a stain that could not be washed away with whiskey or justifications about the war. As the weeks passed, the fervor over the robbery began to fade, but the tension in Kansas City remained. The fairgrounds, once a place of celebration, now carried a stigma. The spot where the girl fell was remembered. The ticket booth was repaired, but the bullet hole in the wood remained for a time, a physical reminder of the violence. For the girl's family, the event was not a sensational headline, but a tragedy that altered their lives. The medical bills mounted, the pain was constant, and the fear of the men who had done this lingered in their home. Jesse James remained at large, moving between safe houses in Clay and Jackson counties. He continued to read the papers, collecting the clippings that described the raid. He saw the descriptions of the daring outlaws and the knights of the road, and he fed on them. He ignored the articles that described the weeping mother of the shot girl or the brutality of the act. He filtered the world to fit his own mythology. But the Kansas City Fair robbery was a crack in the armor. It was the moment when the violence spilled over from the banks and the railroads into the general public. It showed that anyone, even a child at a fair, could be a victim of Jesse James. The legacy of that September day was one of fear. It taught the people of Missouri that they were not spectators to the drama of the James gang. They were potential collateral damage. The Robin Hood who stole from the rich and gave to the poor was exposed as a myth. Jesse stole from the rich, kept the money, and shot the innocent when they got in his way. The girl in the crossfire was the proof. Her suffering was the receipt for the $978 taken from the tin box. The gang spent the winter of 1872 lying low, living off the proceeds of the fair robbery and other thefts. They were hunted, but they were elusive. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was becoming more involved, hired by the express companies and the banks to bring the gang to justice. The robbery at the fair, with its high profile and public nature, increased the pressure on the detectives to get results. The stage was being set for a more direct and violent confrontation between the law and the outlaws. Jesse, in the quiet moments of the winter, cleaned his guns and planned. He did not think of the girl's shattered leg. He thought of the next target, the next adrenaline rush, the next headline. He was a shark that had to keep moving to survive. The violence was not a byproduct of his life. It was the fuel. And as the snow fell on Missouri, covering the tracks of the riders, the memory of the Kansas City Fair, robbery remained a frozen scar on the history of the state, a testament to the day when the carnival turned into a killing field. The girl, whose name would fade from the papers but whose pain would endure, was the living symbol of the gang's ruthlessness. She was the price of Jesse James's legend, paid in blood and bone on a sunny afternoon in September. The narrative of the James gang is often painted in broad strokes of rebellion and romance. But the detail of the fair robbery requires a finer brush, one that captures the grit and the gore. The dust of the track mixed with the gunpowder, the scream of the child cutting through the cheers of the crowd, the cold metallic click of the revolver hammer. These are the realities. The robbery was not a glorious raid, it was a violent mugging performed on a grand stage. The shooting of the girl was not an unfortunate accident. It was the inevitable result of firing weapons into a crowd of human beings. It was a crime of supreme indifference to human life. In the end, the Kansas City Fair robbery served to isolate the gang further. While they still had their hardcore supporters, the general population began to view them with more fear than admiration. You could cheer for a man who robbed a railroad baron. It was harder to cheer for a man who shot a little girl. The tide was beginning to turn slowly, imperceptibly but surely. The water was rising and eventually it would drown them. But for now they rode free, the money in their pockets, the blood on their hands, and the devil at their heels. The sun set on September 26, 1872, leaving Kansas City in shock. The fair continued the next day because commerce always continues, but the atmosphere was changed. The guards were doubled. The people were wary. The shadow of Jesse James lay long across the fairgrounds. He had come, he had taken, and he had hurt. And he had ridden away, untouched, into the welcoming darkness of the Missouri timber, leaving a shattered child and a terrified city to pick up the pieces. This was the true face of the outlaw, not a hero but a hazard as dangerous and unpredictable as a rabid dog in a crowded room. January 31st, 1874 marked a frigid afternoon in the desolate wooded hills of Iron County, Missouri. The location was a lonely siding known as Gad's Hill, a place that barely qualified as a settlement, consisting of little more than a platform and a few scattered structures surrounded by dense timber. The air was sharp and biting. the sky a flat sheet of slate gray that filtered the winter sunlight into a weak, diffuse glow. 5 men, mounted on powerful horses and dressed in heavy woolen coats and slouch hats, emerged from the tree line. They did not ride with the erratic energy of amateurs, but with the calculated precision of a military unit. Jesse James, Frank James, Cole Younger, Robert Younger, and Arthur McCoy moved to secure the area. They took the station agent into custody, securing him in the small depot building along with a handful of locals who had the misfortune of being present. The gang cut the telegraph wires, severing the connection to the outside world, ensuring that no warning could be sent down the line. The target was the Little Rock Express, the southbound train on the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern Railway. It was scheduled to arrive in the late afternoon. The outlaws prepared the trap with mechanical efficiency. They threw the switch on the track, opening it so that the incoming train would be diverted onto the siding rather than continuing on the main line. If the engineer did not stop, the train would derail into the rough ground beyond the spur. They lit a signal fire near the tracks and prepared a red flag, the universal railway signal for danger. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the snow-dusted tracks. The men waited, their breath steaming in the cold air, their hands warming the steel of their revolvers inside their pockets. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, the headlight of the locomotive cut through the gathering gloom. The train approached Gads Hill, the heavy iron wheels clacking rhythmically against the rails. The engineer, seeing the red flag waving frantically near the station, applied the air brakes. The steam hissed loudly as the massive engine slowed, the friction of the wheels throwing sparks. As the train ground to a halt on the siding, the 5 outlaws boarded the train with weapons drawn. They moved with a terrifying calmness. They did not scream or shout initially. They simply took control. One man climbed into the cab, pressing the muzzle of a revolver against the engineer's head, ordering him to keep the train stationary. The others moved to the express car and the passenger coaches. Jesse James entered the first passenger coach, his blue eyes scanning the terrified faces of the travelers. He wore a white linen mask with eye holes cut into it, a ghostly visage that added to the intimidation. The gang had a specific methodology for this robbery. They were not merely stealing, they were performing a piece of political theater. They moved down the aisle, examining the passengers one by one. They demanded to see the hands of the men. If a man had calloused, rough hands, the hands of a farmer, a mechanic, or a laborer, he was passed over. If a man had soft, unblemished hands indicating a life of white-collar work or wealth, he was robbed. Jesse stated clearly that they did not prey on the working man, only on the capitalists and the detectives. They relieved the passengers of watches, jewelry, and wallets. One man, terrified that his hard-earned money would be taken, held up his hands to show the grime and calluses of a laborer. The outlaw nodded and moved on. Another passenger, a Mr. Alford, attempted to hide his wallet. The outlaws spotted the deception, pressed a pistol to his temple, and took the money, warning him that his life was worth less than the leather billfold. In the express car, they forced the messenger to open the safe. They took approximately $2,000 in currency and several packages of mail. It was a successful haul, but the psychological impact was the primary goal. Before leaving, Jesse handed the conductor a prepared press release, a sheet of paper with a pre-written account of the robbery, describing the event as the most daring robbery on record. He instructed the conductor to give it to the newspapers. The gang disembarked, mounted their horses, and rode into the darkening woods, leaving the train and its passengers shaken but largely physically unharmed. They had turned a criminal act into a media event, controlling the narrative before the law could even respond. The Gads Hill robbery was the first train robbery in the state of Missouri, and it sent a shockwave through the establishment. The railroad barons and the governor were humiliated. The impunity with which the James Younger gang operated was a direct challenge to the authority of the state. In Chicago, Alan Pinkerton, the founder of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, took the insult personally. He had been hired by the express companies to hunt down the gang, and he resolved to do so with extreme prejudice. He did not send local sheriffs. He sent his own agents, men trained in espionage and undercover work. In early March of 1874, the Pinkerton Agency launched a covert operation to locate and capture the James brothers. Agent Joseph Witcher was dispatched to Clay County. Witcher was a young, ambitious detective confident in his ability to infiltrate the community. He arrived in Liberty on March 10, 1874, dressed in the clothes of a farm laborer. He wore rough trousers, a worn coat, and carried a carpet bag. His plan was to walk to the James farm, pose as a man looking for work, and gain access to the household to gather intelligence or perhaps make an arrest if the opportunity presented itself. It was a plan born of arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of the environment he was entering. The people of Clay County were fiercely loyal to the James family, and strangers were viewed with immediate suspicion. Witcher took the train to Liberty and then began the walk toward the James farm near Kearney. He did not know that his movements were already being watched. The local network of sympathizers, the Bush Telegraph, was active. As he walked along the road, he was intercepted. The exact details of the abduction remained shrouded in the silence of the conspiracy, but the outcome was stark and brutal. Witcher was not given a chance to explain his cover story. He was identified as a spy, a foreign agent sent to hunt local boys. He was taken captive by a group that included Jesse James, Frank James, and potentially others. The following morning, March 11th, the body of Joseph Witcher was found on a rural road near Independence, Missouri. He had been executed with the cold efficiency of the slaughterhouse. He had been shot 3 times, once in the head and twice in the chest. The wounds were close contact, leaving powder burns on his skin and clothing. There was no sign of a struggle, suggesting he had been bound or held at gunpoint until the final moment. The message was unmistakable. The Pinkertons were not lawmen in the eyes of the James gang. They were invaders, and they would be treated as spies in wartime. Alan Pinkerton, upon receiving the news, was consumed by a cold rage. This was no longer a professional contract. It was a blood feud. While Witcher was meeting his end in Clay County, 2 other Pinkerton agents, Lewis Lull and John Boyle, were hunting the Younger brothers in St. Clair County, Missouri. They were posing as cattle buyers, riding through the rugged country near Monegaw Springs. On March 17, 1874, the agents stopped at the roadside home of Theodore Snuffer, a friend of the Youngers. John and Jim Younger were present at the house. The agents, unaware that their quarry was watching them from behind the curtains, asked for directions. They rode on, but the Youngers, suspicious of the strangers, mounted their horses and pursued them. The confrontation took place on a lonely stretch of road near Roscoe. The Youngers caught up to the agents and ordered them to halt. Lewis Lull, realizing their cover was blown, drew his pistol. The gunfight was chaotic and desperate. John Younger, armed with a shotgun, fired at Lull. Lull, despite being wounded, returned fire with his revolver. The bullet struck John Younger in the neck, severing the carotid artery. John stayed in the saddle for a moment, the blood pumping out of him in rhythmic spurts before he collapsed into the dust, dying within seconds. Jim Younger, seeing his brother fall, unleashed a fury of gunfire. He shot Lewis Lull in the chest. Lull fell from his horse, critically wounded. Agent Boyle, seeing the carnage, fled the scene, escaping into the woods. A local deputy named Daniels, who had been riding with the Pinkertons, was also killed in the exchange. Lewis Lull lingered in agony for several weeks before succumbing to his wounds. The result of the Pinkerton offensive was a disaster. 3 agents dead, a deputy dead, and John Younger dead. The James and Younger brothers remained free, and their hatred for the agency deepened into a mania. The war between the James brothers and the Pinkertons simmered for the rest of the year. Jesse went into hiding, moving his family to various locations, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down. But Alan Pinkerton was not a man to accept defeat. He planned a decisive strike, a raid that would decapitate the gang once and for all. He received intelligence that Jesse and Frank were staying at the family farm in Kearney, visiting their mother, Zerelda Samuel. Pinkerton organized a large strike team of agents, heavily armed and authorized to use whatever force was necessary. They traveled to Missouri in secret, moving by special train to avoid detection. On the night of January 25, 1875, the Pinkerton agents surrounded the farmhouse of Dr. Reuben Samuel and Zerelda Samuel. It was a bitterly cold night, the ground frozen hard as iron. The agents moved through the darkness, positioning themselves around the log and frame structure. They believed Jesse and Frank were inside. The intelligence, however, was flawed. The brothers were not there. Inside the house were Dr. Samuel, Zerelda, their young son Archie Samuel, aged 8, and their daughter. The house was quiet, the family sleeping or preparing for bed. The agents, determined to flush the outlaws out, employed an incendiary device. It was an iron sphere, filled with a flammable substance often referred to as Greek fire, wrapped in kerosene-soaked rags and encased in heavy iron bands. At shortly after midnight on January 26th, one of the agents lit the fuse and hurled the device through the window of the kitchen. The heavy iron ball crashed through the glass and landed on the wooden floor, rolling near the fireplace. The family woke to the sound of shattering glass and the bright, sputtering light of the burning fuse. Dr. Samuel, believing the object was a simple lamp or a flare, rushed to investigate. Zerelda was right behind him. The 8-year-old Archie, curious and frightened, also moved toward the light. Dr. Samuel tried to kick the object into the fireplace to contain the danger. As his foot made contact, or perhaps simply as the timer ran out, the device exploded. The blast was horrific. The iron casing shattered into jagged shrapnel that tore through the small room with the velocity of rifle bullets. A massive fragment of iron struck Zerelda Samuel in the right arm, below the elbow. The metal smashed through the bone and muscle, leaving her arm hanging by mere threads of skin and tendon, effectively severed. Another piece of shrapnel struck young Archie Samuel in the side. The jagged iron punched a hole through the boy's abdomen, tearing through his internal organs. He collapsed onto the floor, screaming in agony. Dr. Samuel was scorched and cut, but survived the initial blast. The room filled with thick, acrid smoke and the smell of burnt powder and seared flesh. The Pinkerton agents, realizing the explosion had not flushed out armed men but had only resulted in the screams of a woman and a child, did not storm the house. They retreated into the darkness, fading away into the night as the reality of their botched raid became clear. Inside the farmhouse, the scene was one of absolute nightmare. Zerelda, clutching the stump of her arm, tried to comfort her dying son. Blood covered the floorboards. The family was alone in the cold night, maimed and broken. Archie Samuel lingered in excruciating pain for several hours. The injury was catastrophic. There was no medical intervention that could save him. He died in the early hours of the morning, an innocent victim of a war he did not understand. Zerelda Samuel required an emergency amputation. A local doctor, summoned in the aftermath, had to remove the remainder of her right arm below the elbow. She survived the surgery, but she was permanently disfigured, a living martyr to the cause of her sons. The news of the raid on the James farm ignited a firestorm of public outrage. Even those who condemned the robberies were horrified by the attack. The Pinkertons had thrown a bomb into a house occupied by women and children. They had killed an 8-year-old boy and maimed a mother. It was a tactical and public relations catastrophe for the agency. The sympathy of the public swung violently back toward the James brothers. They were no longer just outlaws. They were the victims of a tyrannical, extra-legal force that murdered children in the dead of night. For Jesse James, the raid was the final psychological break. Any lingering restraint he might have possessed evaporated. He was hundreds of miles away when it happened. But the news reached him quickly. The death of his half-brother Archie and the mutilation of his mother filled him with a cold, bottomless hatred. He viewed the Pinkertons not as men, but as monsters to be exterminated. He vowed vengeance, a blood oath that would drive him to even greater acts of violence. He wrote letters to the newspapers, his prose dripping with venom, calling for justice and justifying his own actions as a defense against a government that sanctioned the murder of children. The Gads Hill robbery had shown Jesse's tactical brilliance and his flair for the dramatic. The Pinkerton raid showed the cost of that life. The violence he had unleashed on the railroads and the banks had come home to roost, not on him, but on his family. The events of 1874 and 1875 hardened the hearts of everyone involved. The line between lawman and criminal had been completely erased. Both sides were now operating as death squads, willing to kill indiscriminately to achieve their ends. The aftermath of the bombing left the James farm a place of mourning and bitterness. Zerelda, now one-armed, became a fierce defender of her sons, her hatred for the authorities calcified by her loss. She would wave her stump at visitors, a graphic indictment of the Pinkerton agency. The grave of Archie Samuel in the family plot became a shrine to the family's persecution complex. For the Pinkertons, the failure was absolute. They had not caught Jesse or Frank. They had lost 3 agents and a deputy. They had killed a child. Alan Pinkerton, facing legal threats and public condemnation, eventually called off the pursuit, declaring that the James brothers were too difficult to catch in a county that protected them so fiercely. He retreated to Chicago, leaving the field to the outlaws. This period marked the zenith of the James gang's power and the nadir of their morality. They had survived the onslaught of the most powerful detective agency in the world. They were seemingly invincible, but the victory was hollow. It was built on the corpse of a little boy and the severed arm of a mother. The Robin Hood myth was now fueled by tragedy, allowing Jesse to cloak his crimes in the rhetoric of revenge. He was no longer robbing for money. He was robbing to hurt the system that had hurt him. The Gads Hill robbery had started the year with a theatrical flourish, but the raid on the farm ended the era with a grim, bloody reality that no press release could spin. The war was total, and the casualties were mounting on both sides. September 7, 1876 dawned over the burgeoning town of Northfield, Minnesota, with a sharp, crystalline clarity that heralded the approaching autumn. This was not the lawless, dusty frontier of the Missouri borderlands, where the James Younger gang had cut their teeth. It was a settled, industrious community built on the power of the Cannon River and the commerce of the northern plains. The streets were wide and lined with substantial 2-story buildings of brick and limestone, projecting an atmosphere of permanence, civic pride, and order. The air was cool and smelled of the massive Ames mill, where wheat was ground into flour, mixing with the scent of the damp riverbanks and the faint, sweet odor of curing hay from the surrounding farmland. The population was a mix of Yankee transplants and Scandinavian immigrants, people who believed in the rule of law and the sanctity of commerce. Into this organized society rode 8 men who were alien to its rhythm. Predators camouflaged in long linen dusters who viewed the town not as a community, but as a vault to be cracked. The gang had spent weeks infiltrating the region, moving through Minneapolis and St. Paul, purchasing high-quality horseflesh and observing the habits of the locals. They were far from their network of Confederate sympathizers, operating in hostile territory where no safe houses awaited them. The group consisted of the core triumvirate, Jesse James, Frank James, and Cole Younger, supported by the younger brothers Jim and Bob Younger, and the seasoned gunmen Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, and Bill Chadwell. Chadwell was the only member with local knowledge, having lived in the area previously, and the gang relied on his guidance to navigate the unfamiliar geography of lakes and woods. They wore heavy wool suits beneath their linen coats, sweating in the midday sun, the fabric concealing the terrifying arsenal strapped to their bodies. Each man carried at least 2 heavy-caliber revolvers, primarily Colts and Remingtons, along with belts loop-filled with lead cartridges. They were a mobile armory, a cavalry unit gone rogue, riding towards a collision with a citizenry they woefully underestimated. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the gang initiated their plan. They approached Northfield from the west, crossing the iron bridge that spanned the Cannon River. They divided their force into 3 distinct tactical units to control the environment. The first group, consisting of Jesse James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts, dismounted near the center of the mill square. They tied their horses or left them ground-tied near the front of the First National Bank, a sturdy brick building located on the corner of Division and 4th Streets. They walked with a practiced casualness, their spurs jingling softly on the wooden sidewalk, their eyes scanning the street for threats. They pushed through the heavy double doors of the bank, the bell above the entrance announcing the beginning of the nightmare. The second unit, comprised of Cole Younger and Clell Miller, remained mounted in the street. Their role was to act as sentries, guarding the entrance and intimidating the locals. The third group, Frank James, Jim Younger, and Bill Chadwell, held the rear at the bridge to secure the only viable escape route across the river. The plan was a standard paramilitary raid, a tactic that had paralyzed towns in Missouri and Kentucky for a decade. They expected the citizens of Northfield to freeze at the sight of a gun, to cower in the face of their aggression. But the psychological landscape of the North was different, and the gang was about to discover that the war they thought they were still fighting had produced veterans on both sides. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of paper and the scratching of pens. 3 employees were present: Joseph Lee Haywood, the acting cashier, Alonzo Bunker, the teller, and Frank Wilcox, the bookkeeper. Haywood was seated at the cashier's desk, a position of responsibility he took with absolute seriousness. He looked up as the 3 men in dusters entered, expecting a deposit or a business inquiry. Instead, the strangers moved with sudden, violent speed. They drew their massive revolvers, the long barrels catching the light from the windows. Jesse James vaulted over the counter, his boots landing heavily on the floorboards inside the cage. He leveled his pistol at Haywood's face, the bore of the .44 caliber weapon looking enormous in the confined space. Jesse demanded the opening of the safe. His voice was a harsh rasp, filled with the urgency of the crime. He knew the vault contained thousands of dollars, the capital of the local mills and the college. Joseph Lee Haywood, however, was not a man to be cowed. Despite the gun in his face, despite the clear and present danger of death, he made a split-second decision to resist. He looked the outlaw in the eye and stated firmly that the safe was secured by a time lock and could not be opened. This was a lie. The door of the safe was closed, but the bolts were not thrown, and the time lock had not yet been engaged. Haywood was gambling his life to protect the depositor's money. Enraged by the refusal, Jesse struck Haywood violently across the head with the barrel of his revolver. The heavy steel impacted the cashier's skull with a sickening thud, cutting the scalp and knocking him to the floor. Haywood, dazed and bleeding, his vision swimming, did not yield. He staggered to his feet, swaying. Jesse grabbed him by the collar, shoving the tip of a Bowie knife against his throat, drawing a bead of blood. He screamed at the cashier, threatening to slit his throat if he did not unlock the door. Haywood, gasping for air, shook his head. He would not open the safe. The stalemate inside the bank was turning into a scene of torture, consuming precious minutes that the gang did not have. While the interior of the bank descended into brutality, the situation on the street began to unravel. J.S. Allen, a local hardware merchant, attempted to enter the bank to conduct his afternoon business. As he approached the door, Clell Miller, who was guarding the entrance, grabbed him roughly by the coat and shoved him backward. Miller brandished his revolver, his face twisted in a snarl, and ordered Allen to get away. Allen did not flee in silence. He retreated to the safety of the storefronts and then turned, cupping his hands around his mouth. He bellowed a warning that echoed across the square. "Get your guns, boys! They're robbing the bank!" The cry acted as a catalyst. The citizens of Northfield did not hide. They hunted. Elias Stacy, a robust local, ran to a nearby location to retrieve a shotgun. A.R. Manning, another hardware merchant, sprinted into his store and grabbed a single-shot Remington rolling block rifle, a powerful weapon capable of bringing down big game. Henry Wheeler, a young medical student home on vacation from the University of Michigan, was sitting outside the Dampier House Hotel on the opposite side of the square. Seeing the robbery unfold, he realized he was unarmed. He ran into the hotel, dashed up the stairs to the second floor, and found an old Army carbine, a relic of the Civil War. He grabbed a handful of cartridges and positioned himself at a window that offered a commanding view of the street below. Cole Younger and Clell Miller, hearing the shouts and seeing the sudden activity, realized the element of surprise was lost. They initiated the hurrahing tactic, spurring their horses into a gallop and riding up and down Division Street. They fired their revolvers wildly, aiming at the windows and the brick facades, the bullets chipping the masonry and shattering glass. They screamed rebel yells, trying to create a wall of noise and terror. But the men of Northfield were steady. They took cover behind wagons, in doorways, and in second-story windows, and they began to return fire. The street erupted into a chaotic, close-quarters firefight. Henry Wheeler, calm amidst the noise, rested the barrel of his carbine on the windowsill. He sighted on Clell Miller, who was struggling to control his frightened horse near the bank entrance. Wheeler squeezed the trigger. The carbine roared, sending a heavy lead slug tearing through the air. The bullet struck Miller in the left shoulder, severing the subclavian artery. A fountain of bright arterial blood sprayed from the wound, soaking Miller's duster. The outlaw reeled in the saddle, his face going pale with shock. He tried to dismount, but his strength was gone. A second shot struck him in the chest, puncturing his lung. Miller tumbled from his horse, crashing onto the hard-packed dirt of the street, dying in a pool of his own blood. Simultaneously, A.R. Manning took aim from the corner of the Scriver building. He saw Bill Chadwell, the guide, riding hard near the intersection, trying to provide cover fire. Manning tracked him with the rolling block rifle. He fired. The bullet struck Chadwell squarely in the chest, piercing his heart. The impact was massive. Chadwell was knocked backward off his horse as if struck by an invisible fist. He hit the ground dead, his body lying sprawled in the dust, his knowledge of the escape routes lost with him. The gang had lost 2 men in less than 2 minutes. The myth of their invincibility was being dismantled by a hardware clerk and a medical student. The violence spilled over onto the innocent. Nicholas Gustafson, a Swedish immigrant who spoke very little English, was standing near the intersection of 5th and Division Streets. He did not understand the shouts to clear the street or the nature of the conflict. He stood confused, watching the commotion. One of the outlaws, likely Cole Younger or one of the fleeing sentries, fired at the figure standing in their path. The bullet struck Gustafson in the head. The immigrant collapsed, mortally wounded, becoming the first civilian casualty of the disaster. He would linger for several days before dying, a tragic victim of a language barrier and a stray bullet. Inside the bank, the robbery had become a fiasco. Alonzo Bunker, the teller, saw an opportunity while the outlaws were distracted by the roar of the gun battle outside. He bolted for the back door of the bank. Charlie Pitts saw him run and fired. The bullet struck Bunker in the right shoulder, but the teller managed to crash through the door and escape into the alley, shouting for help. Jesse and Bob Younger were left with the defiant Haywood and the terrified Wilcox. They heard the screams of their comrades outside, warning them that they were surrounded and taking heavy fire. Jesse James realized the game was up. There would be no money. The resistance of the cashier and the armed response of the town had defeated them. A cold, murderous rage washed over him. He looked at Joseph Lee Haywood, the man who had denied him the prize, the man who was still standing despite the pistol whipping. Jesse did not just leave. He turned back, leveled his revolver at the cashier's head from a distance of a few feet, and fired a single, vindictive shot. The bullet entered Haywood's skull, killing him instantly. It was an execution born of spite, the act of a man who could not accept defeat. Haywood's body slid to the floor, the final sacrifice of the day. The three men inside the bank burst out onto the sidewalk, stepping into a hail of lead. The scene that greeted them was a catastrophe. Clell Miller lay dead in the street. Bill Chadwell was dead at the corner. The air was filled with the sharp crack of rifles and the whine of ricochets. Cole Younger rode up to the bank entrance, his horse dancing amidst the gunfire, shouting that they had to ride immediately. The men on foot scrambled for their horses, their dusters flapping in the wind. Bob Younger, running to his mount, was targeted by the relentless A.R. Manning. Manning fired his rifle. The heavy bullet smashed into Bob's right elbow, shattering the bone and rendering his arm useless. Bob crumbled to the ground, his pistol falling from his paralyzed hand. He struggled to rise, his face twisted in agony, switching his revolver to his left hand. Cole Younger, seeing his brother fall, performed an act of desperate loyalty. He turned his horse into the teeth of the gunfire, rode to Bob, and helped him mount behind him. The gang was now carrying wounded men, their firepower reduced, their cohesion shattered. They spurred their horses toward the Dundas Road, fleeing south across the bridge. They left behind the bodies of Miller and Chadwell. They left behind the wounded Gustafson, who died days later, and the murdered Haywood. They took only $26.70 from the bank. The raid was a total, humiliating failure. As they rode out of town, they were a tattered, bleeding remnant of the force that had arrived with such arrogance. Cole Younger had been hit in the thigh. Frank James had a grazing wound. Bob Younger's arm was hanging by threads of flesh. They dripped blood onto the saddles and the road, marking their trail with the evidence of their defeat. The escape from Northfield became a harrowing ordeal of endurance and pain that lasted for 2 weeks. The gang was deep in enemy territory with no guide and no fresh horses. The telegraph wires hummed with the news of the raid, alerting every sheriff and deputy in Minnesota. The entire state turned into a hunting ground. Posses formed in every town, thousands of men armed with shotguns and rifles, eager to catch the men who had murdered a bank cashier and disturbed the peace of the North. The weather turned against them. A cold, relentless rain began to fall, turning the roads to mud and soaking their clothes. The outlaws abandoned their horses, which were exhausted and too distinctive to keep. They continued on foot, limping through the thick woods and swamps west of Mankato. Their boots disintegrated in the mud. Their wounds, untreated and exposed to the filth of the road, began to fester. They ate raw corn stripped from the fields and stole chickens from isolated farms, eating them raw or half-cooked to avoid making smoke. The cohesion of the group began to fracture under the strain of the misery. Jesse James, ever the survivor, proposed that they kill the wounded Bob Younger because he was slowing them down and endangering the group. Cole Younger, loyal to his blood above all else, refused. telling Jesse that he would stay with his brother until the end. This disagreement led to the final split. Jesse and Frank James separated from the younger brothers and Charlie Pitts. The James brothers, less severely wounded and ruthless in their self-preservation, stole a pair of horses and broke away, heading west toward the Dakotas to vanish into the vastness of the plains. They prioritized their own survival over the bond of the gang. The Youngers and Charlie Pitts were left behind on foot, limping through the sloughs, their progress agonizingly slow. On September 21st, 2 weeks after the raid, the Youngers and Pitts were cornered in a swampy thicket named Hanska Slough by a posse led by Sheriff Glispin. The gunfight that ensued was a massacre. Charlie Pitts was killed, shot 5 times in the chest and head. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, were riddled with bullets. Cole was shot 11 times, Jim was shot 5 times, including a wound that shattered his upper jaw. Bob was shot in the chest. Yet incredibly, the Youngers survived the barrage. They were captured, bloodied, and broken and hauled off to the prison at Stillwater. Their criminal careers ended forever in the mud of a Minnesota swamp. For Jesse James, the Northfield raid was the effective end of his reign as a national terror. He had lost his most capable lieutenants. He had lost the younger brothers who provided the muscle, the loyalty, and the stability for the gang. He had been humiliated on a national stage, defeated not by Pinkerton agents or federal soldiers, but by shopkeepers, students, and farmers. The image of the invincible guerrilla warrior was stained by the reality of the dead cashier and the desperate flight into the rain. He rode back to Missouri a diminished figure, paranoid and isolated, having left his friends to rot in a northern prison while he saved his own skin. The brutality of Northfield was not in the number of dead, but in the sheer desperation and incompetence of the violence. The murder of Haywood was the act of a petulant child with a gun, lashing out because he was denied what he wanted. The shooting of the immigrant Gustafson was the careless destruction of a bystander who simply stood in the wrong place. The raid proved that the gang had no magical protection, no divine mandate. They were flesh and blood, and they could bleed just like the men they terrorized. The Robin Hood had come to the North, and the North had seen him for what he was, a thief and a killer, nothing more. As the smoke cleared from Division Street on that September afternoon, the town of Northfield stood victorious. They had repelled the most dangerous men in America. The bodies of Miller and Chadwell were propped up and photographed, gruesome trophies of the town's defense. But the cost was the life of Joseph Lee Haywood, a man who died defending a safe that wasn't even locked, simply because he refused to bow to a man with a gun. His death was the defining moment of the raid, a testament to the fact that Jesse James's legend was built on the graves of men who possessed a quiet courage he would never understand. The rain that fell in the days after the raid washed away the blood from the streets of Northfield, but it could not wash away the memory of the violence. The James Younger gang had been shattered, their invincibility disproven by the crack of a medical student's carbine and the refusal of a cashier to yield. October 8, 1879. Settled over the hamlet of Glendale, Missouri, with a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the few structures standing near the tracks of the Chicago and Alton Railroad. Glendale was hardly a town. It was a lonely outpost in Jackson County, situated roughly 20 miles from Kansas City. It consisted of a small depot, a post office, and a general store, all hemmed in by the dense timber and rugged hills that defined the landscape. The night was cool and damp, the air heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and the coal smoke that lingered near the rail line. In the shadows of the tree line, a group of 6 men waited. These were not the disciplined, stoic veterans of the Northfield raid. The composition of the gang had changed, reflecting the desperation and the declining standards of their leader. Jesse James, now living under the alias of J.D. Howard, sat atop his horse, his face harder and more lined than it had been 3 years prior. His eyes, always restless, now held a glint of permanent paranoia. Beside him rode Frank James, the only other survivor of the old guard. The rest were new recruits. Tucker Basham, a local man with a weakness for whiskey. Bill Ryan, a rowdy and unpredictable thug. Ed Miller, the younger brother of the deceased Clell Miller. And Dick Little, a horse thief with a loose tongue. This new iteration of the gang lacked the military precision of the younger brothers. They were rougher, louder, and less reliable, held together not by bonds of blood or shared service in the war, but by the sheer, terrifying force of Jesse's will. They had gathered in the woods to wait for the southbound Chicago and Alton train, scheduled to pass through Glendale in the evening. The plan was simple, brutal, and devoid of the theatricality that had characterized the Gads Hill robbery. There would be no press releases handed to conductors, no speeches about targeting the rich. This was a raid for cash, executed with the raw aggression of men who had nothing left to lose. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, the gang made their move. They rode out of the timber and descended upon the tiny settlement. Their first target was the general store, which also served as the post office. They burst through the door with weapons drawn, their faces covered by masks made of white cloth with crude eye holes cut into them. The few locals inside, loafers warming themselves by the stove and the storekeeper, were instantly terrified. The gang members, shouting profanities and waving their heavy revolvers, herded the civilians into a corner. They did not treat them with the courtesy of the past. They shoved them, kicked them, and threatened to blow their brains out if they made a sound. Tucker Basham, smelling of liquor, stood guard over the hostages, his finger resting heavily on the trigger of his gun. Jesse and the others moved to the depot itself. Inside, the station agent, Mr. McIntyre, was working at the telegraph key. He looked up to see the masked men entering his office. Jesse leveled his .44 caliber revolver at the agent's head and ordered him to step away from the instrument. One of the gang members, likely Ed Miller, smashed the telegraph equipment with the butt of his pistol, sending springs and brass components skittering across the floor. This severed communication with the rest of the line, ensuring that no warning could be sent to the approaching train or the authorities in Kansas City. The outlaws then turned their attention to the signal lights. Jesse grabbed McIntyre by the collar of his coat and dragged him outside to the platform. He shoved the muzzle of his revolver into the agent's ribs and ordered him to lower the green light, which signaled all clear, and replace it with the red light, signaling danger and requiring an immediate stop. McIntyre, trembling uncontrollably in the chill night air, complied. He hoisted the red lantern into position. The trap was set. The gang forced the agent back inside the depot, throwing him in with the other hostages. They extinguished the lights in the station, plunging the platform into darkness. They took up positions behind the woodpiles in the corners of the building, waiting for the iron horse to arrive. At approximately 8 o'clock, the distant wail of a steam whistle pierced the silence of the woods. The ground began to vibrate with the approach of the heavy locomotive. The headlight of the train cut a bright yellow cone through the darkness, illuminating the rails and the empty platform. The engineer, seeing the red signal light hanging ominously in the dark station, reacted immediately. He shut off the steam and applied the air brakes. The sparks flew from the wheels as the iron shoes bit into the metal, the screech of friction filling the valley. The massive engine hissed and groaned as it came to a halt directly in front of the depot. Before the wheels had stopped turning completely, the gang swarmed the train. They did not board as passengers, they attacked as a boarding party. They fired their revolvers into the air and along the sides of the cars, shattering windows and sending glass flying into the passenger compartments. The noise was deafening, a calculated assault on the senses designed to induce panic. Jesse James and Ed Miller ran toward the express car, the location of the safe and the valuables. The conductor, William Grimes, stepped out onto the platform to investigate the reason for the stop. He was met by the barrel of a pistol. The outlaws ordered him to stand still and keep his hands raised. The focus of the raid was the express car, operated by the United States Express Company. Inside was the messenger, also named William Grimes, a coincidence that often confuses historical accounts but distinct from the conductor. The messenger, Grimes, was responsible for the safe and its contents. Hearing the gunfire and the shouting outside, he realized instantly that the train was being robbed. He made a desperate attempt to secure the money. He unlocked the safe, grabbed a package containing thousands of dollars, and attempted to hide it in a satchel or behind some crates. However, the time was too short. The side door of the express car was battered open. Jesse James and Ed Miller vaulted into the car. They were masked, their eyes wild, their weapons smoking from the shots fired outside. They found Grimes standing near the safe. Jesse did not ask politely for the keys. He screamed at the messenger, demanding the money. Grimes, showing a stubborn bravery similar to the cashier at Northfield, hesitated. He claimed he did not have the key or that the safe was empty. This defiance was met with immediate savage violence. Jesse did not shoot the messenger. He decided to break him. He reversed his heavy revolver, gripping it by the long barrel, turning the heavy steel butt into a bludgeon. He swung the weapon with his full strength. The metal handle struck William Grimes directly in the face. The impact was sickening, the sound of steel crushing bone audible over the hissing of the steam engine. The blow split the messenger's scalp and smashed his cheekbone. Grimes reeled backward, blood spraying from the gash, blinding him. He collapsed to the floor of the car, dazed and semi-conscious. The brutality did not end with the first strike. Jesse stood over the fallen man, his rage uncontained. He kicked Grimes in the ribs, demanding the key. When Grimes, groggy and bleeding profusely, did not respond fast enough, Jesse struck him again with the pistol, this time on the back of the head. The violence was gratuitous, a physical manifestation of Jesse's deteriorating mental state and his growing intolerance for any resistance. The Robin Hood who supposedly treated his victims with chivalry was gone, replaced by a thug who beat unarmed men into submission. With the messenger incapacitated, the outlaws turned their attention to the safe. They found the key, or perhaps the safe was already unlocked from Grimes' attempt to hide the loot. They ripped the door open. Inside, they found a substantial haul. They began to stuff the money into a grain sack they had brought with them. They took packages of greenbacks and gold coin. The total amount taken varies in reports, but it was estimated to be between $6,000 and $10,000, a fortune that would fund their run from the law for another year. They ripped open mail bags, scattering letters across the bloody floor of the car, looking for registered mail containing cash. While the looting of the express car was taking place, the other gang members patrolled the length of the train, firing shots to keep the passengers' heads down. They did not enter the passenger coaches to rob the individuals. This was a strategic decision. Robbing passengers took time and increased the risk of resistance. The express car was the high-value target. However, the terror inflicted on the passengers was real. They huddled on the floor, listening to the shouts, the gunshots, and the sound of boots on the gravel outside. A few bullets penetrated the wooden walls of the coaches, lodging in the seats and the woodwork, inches from terrified travelers. Back in the express car, William Grimes lay in a pool of his own blood. The outlaws finished clearing the safe. They grabbed the heavy sack. Jesse looked down at the battered messenger one last time. There was no apology, no offer of medical aid. He simply stepped over the man's prone body and jumped from the car door to the ground. The raid had taken less than 10 minutes. In that time, they had secured a fortune and brutally maimed a man. The gang gathered on the far side of the tracks where their horses were tied. They mounted up, the animals skittish from the noise and the smell of the black powder smoke. The signal was given to ride. They thundered off into the darkness of the woods, heading south toward the Snaya Bar Creek, a rugged area of ravines and thickets that offered perfect cover. They left behind a scene of chaos. The train crew, once they were sure the bandits were gone, rushed to the express car. They found Grimes unconscious, his face a ruin of bruised flesh and exposed bone. The floor was slick with blood and scattered papers. The train eventually limped into the next station, carrying the wounded messenger and the story of the raid. The news traveled via telegraph once the lines were repaired. "The James Gang strikes again," the headlines screamed. But the tone of the reporting was shifting. The details of the beating of William Grimes were widely circulated. This was not a daring feat of horsemanship. It was a sordid, ugly assault. The public, even those who secretly admired the outlaws, found it difficult to justify the bludgeoning of a defenseless railroad employee. The brutality solidified the image of the gang as vicious criminals rather than political rebels. The escape from Glendale was marked by the erratic behavior of the new gang members. As they rode through the night, Tucker Basham, exhilarated by the success and the adrenaline, reportedly began to brag and laugh. Jesse, riding at the head of the column, silenced him with a sharp rebuke. He knew that the pursuit would be intense. The railroad companies and the governor were furious. They would spare no expense in hunting them down. The gang rode hard for the rest of the night, covering miles of rough terrain to put distance between themselves and the crime scene. They stopped in the early hours of the morning in a deep ravine to divide the spoils. They poured the contents of the sack onto a blanket spread on the ground. By the light of a small, shielded fire, they counted the money. The greenbacks and the gold coins glittered in the firelight. They split the take evenly, though Jesse and Frank likely took a larger share for expenses. The sight of the money temporarily smoothed over the tensions within the group, but the cracks were there. Basham and Little were weak links. They were not hardened ideologues like the James brothers. They were criminals of opportunity, and money was their only loyalty. The Glendale robbery reignited the manhunt in Missouri. Major James Liggett, a special agent for the railroad, took charge of the investigation. He understood that he could not catch the James brothers in a direct confrontation in the woods. He had to rot the gang from the inside. He began to target the weaker members, specifically Tucker Basham. The investigation that followed Glendale would eventually lead to the arrest of Basham, who, under pressure and the threat of a long prison sentence, would turn state's evidence. His testimony would provide the law with the first inside look at the new gang's operations and the locations of their hideouts. For Jesse James, the Glendale raid was a financial success but a strategic failure. The money allowed him to maintain his lifestyle and support his family, but the violence of the act drew increased scrutiny. The beating of Grimes showed a lack of control. In the old days, the Youngers might have handled the messenger with intimidation rather than a skull-crushing blow. Now, with men like Ed Miller and Bill Ryan, the default setting was maximum violence. Jesse was no longer leading a band of brothers. He was managing a crew of violent sociopaths, and he had to be the most violent among them to maintain his authority. The injury to William Grimes was severe. He survived, but he carried the scars of that night for the rest of his life. He suffered from headaches and neurological issues resulting from the concussion and the fractures. He was a living testament to the cruelty of the man the dime novels called a hero. The narrative of the gentleman bandit could not survive the reality of a pistol butt to the face. The Glendale robbery stripped away the last vestiges of the myth. It revealed the gang for what they had become, a group of desperate men who would crush anyone who stood between them and a bag of money. As the gang dispersed after dividing the loot, fading back into the anonymous farming communities of western Missouri, the darkness of the October night seemed to linger over them. They were rich in stolen gold, but they were spiritually bankrupt. The camaraderie of the campfire was replaced by suspicious glances and hands hovering near holsters. Jesse rode away from the division of the spoils alone or with Frank, trusting no one fully. The brutality at Glendale was a signal flare, marking the beginning of the final treacherous chapter of his life, where the danger would come not from the Pinkertons or the sheriffs, but from the men riding right beside him. The seeds of betrayal were watered by the blood of William Grimes, and they would soon bloom in the form of a Ford Brothers gun. September 7th, 1881, arrived with a suffocating humidity that clung to the deep ravines and limestone cuts of Jackson County, Missouri. The location was a place known locally as Blue Cut, a deep man-made gash in the earth where the Chicago and Alton Railroad sliced through the Rocky Hills 2 miles west of Glendale. It was the same stretch of track the gang had terrorized 2 years prior, a deliberate choice that signaled arrogance bordering on a death wish. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the cut in absolute darkness, the high walls of earth and stone blocking out the moonlight and creating a tunnel of shadows. Inside this trench, 6 men waited. The composition of the group had devolved significantly from the disciplined unit of the war years. Jesse James and Frank James were the only constants, the hardened survivors. The rest were a motley collection of drifters and hired guns. Wood Height, Jesse's cousin; Clarence Height, Wood's brother; Dick Little, a horse thief with shifting loyalties; and Charlie Ford, a young man whose eyes watched Jesse with a mixture of fear and calculation. The atmosphere in the cut was toxic. Jesse James, now living under the alias Thomas Howard in Kansas City, was a man disintegrating under the weight of his own legend and the constant pressure of the manhunt. His blinking tic had worsened, becoming a constant spasm, and his temper was a hair-trigger mechanism that required no provocation. He paced the gravel ballast of the track, his boots crunching loudly in the silence. He barked orders in a low, vicious whisper. He did not trust the men around him, perhaps not even Frank. He knew that the governor's reward money, $10,000 for his capture, was a temptation that could turn any friend into an assassin. To ensure loyalty, he ruled through terror, reminding them constantly of his willingness to kill traitors. The preparation for the robbery was crude and physical. The gang did not rely on signal lights or deception as they had in the past. They opted for brute force. They dragged heavy crossties, large stones, and fallen timber onto the tracks, building a barricade directly in the path of the westbound express. It was a wrecking tactic, one that risked derailing the train and killing everyone on board. Jesse supervised the labor, his hand never straying far from the pair of heavy revolvers strapped to his waist. He checked the pile of debris, ensuring it was substantial enough to smash the pilot of the locomotive. They took their positions in the weeds and the brush clinging to the sides of the cut, pulling their white masks over their faces. The masks were now less of a disguise and more of a uniform of the macabre, ghost-like in the gloom. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, the rails began to hum. The beam of the locomotive's headlights swept around the curve, illuminating the jagged walls of the cut. The train, the westbound Express No. 3, was moving at a steady pace, the engineer L. Foote peering into the darkness. As the light hit the obstruction on the tracks, Foote slammed the throttle shut and engaged the air brakes. The train shuddered violently, the metal wheels screaming against the iron rails as they locked. The momentum carried the massive engine forward, sliding uncontrollably toward the barricade. It struck the pile of stones and timber with a deafening crash, the cowcatcher smashing the wood to splinters and sending rocks tumbling. The locomotive lurched but remained upright, coming to a halt amidst a cloud of steam and dust. Before the echoes of the crash had faded, the gang descended. They did not swarm with the precision of soldiers, but with the chaotic aggression of a mob. They fired their weapons indiscriminately into the ground and the air, the muzzle flashes lighting up the dark ravine like strobes. Jesse James led the assault on the engine cab. He climbed up the steel steps, shoving his revolver into the face of the engineer, Foot, and the fireman, John Stebbing. He was screaming, his voice high and ragged. He struck Foot on the shoulder with the barrel of his gun, ordering him to climb down. The engineer and fireman were dragged onto the gravel, where they were guarded by Woodhite, who held a gun on them with a nervous, shaking hand. Jesse, Frank, and the others ran to the express car. The messenger, H.A. Fox, heard the commotion and knew what was coming. Unlike the messenger at Glendale, Fox did not attempt to hide or resist. He knew the stories of the beatings. When the outlaws battered on the door, threatening to blow the car up with dynamite, a bluff as they had none. Fox slid the heavy door open. Jesse vaulted inside, followed by Charlie Ford. The outlaw leader was in a frenzy. He grabbed Fox by the collar and shoved him against the wall. He did not ask for the keys politely. He struck the messenger across the face with the butt of his pistol. The blow was immediate and punitive, inflicted not for resistance but to establish dominance. Fox, bleeding from the mouth, handed over the keys to the safe. The safe was opened, but the contents were a disappointment. It contained a relatively small amount of currency, perhaps $2,000, far less than the massive hauls of the past. This failure to secure a fortune enraged Jesse further. He began to tear the car apart, ripping open mail sacks and scattering letters across the floor. He found a few registered packages containing smaller sums, but it was not enough to justify the risk. His rage spilled over. He turned back to the messenger, Fox, and struck him again with the heavy revolver, knocking the man to the floor. He kicked the messenger, cursing him for not having more money, acting as if the railroad employee were personally responsible for the gang's financial woes. Leaving the battered messenger in the wrecked express car, Jesse led the gang to the passenger coaches. This was a deviation from their usual tactic. In the past, they often avoided robbing the passengers to maintain the myth that they only targeted the corporations. At Blue Cut, that pretense was abandoned. They were desperate, and they were going to strip everyone. They boarded the coaches, mud on their boots and murder in their eyes. The passengers, men and women alike, were terrified. They saw the masked men moving down the aisle, shoving canvas sacks into people's faces. Jesse James walked the aisle of the smoking car, his behavior erratic and terrifying. He stopped at the seat of a brakeman who had taken refuge among the passengers. Jesse accused the man of hiding money. When the brakeman denied it, Jesse raised his pistol and brought the barrel down hard on the man's head. The sound of steel on skull sickened the other passengers. The brakeman slumped forward, blood streaming down his face. Jesse laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He moved to the next passenger, a stone mason. He demanded the man's watch. When the man fumbled, Jesse jammed the gun into his stomach, threatening to disembowel him. The robbery of the passengers was petty and vicious. They took watches, wedding rings, and pocket change. They terrified women, shouting obscenities and waving their guns in their faces. There was no chivalry here. One passenger, a flamboyant man from New York, attempted to joke with the outlaws to diffuse the tension. Frank James, who was guarding the rear of the car, stepped forward and slapped the man across the face, telling him to keep his mouth shut. The gang collected the jewelry and the wallets, throwing them into the sack with the meager loot from the express safe. The conductor of the train, J.M. Westfall, was also singled out. Jesse found him and immediately accused him of being a Pinkerton agent or working with the detectives. Westfall denied it, but Jesse was beyond reason. He struck Westfall with the pistol, cutting his scalp. He then shoved the conductor down the aisle, using him as a human shield while they moved between cars. Jesse shouted at the passengers that he was going to kill the governor and anyone who helped him. He was ranting, his political grievances mixing with his criminal greed in a confused diatribe. He held up a letter he had written, a rambling manifesto, and shoved it into Westfall's pocket, ordering him to give it to the newspapers. The ordeal lasted for approximately 30 minutes. In that half hour, the gang terrorized nearly 100 people. They had pistol-whipped 3 railroad employees, threatened to execute the engineer, and robbed innocent travelers of their personal property. As they prepared to leave, Jesse walked back to the engineer, foot. In a bizarre display of mood swings, he shook the engineer's hand and gave him $2 silver, telling him to drink to the health of Jesse James. It was a manic gesture, a flicker of the old performative outlaw trying to break through the surface of the thug he had become. Then, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the cut, followed by his men. The gang scrambled up the steep embankments to where their horses were tied in the timber. They mounted up and rode hard to the south, crossing the Snyabar Creek. The escape was tense. They did not ride as a band of brothers, but as a group of suspicious conspirators. Jesse rode at the rear, or constantly checked behind him, ensuring that none of his own men were raising a gun to his back. They rode through the night, the horses splashing through the mud, the stolen watches jingling in the sack. They stopped miles away in a dense thicket to divide the loot. The take was pitiful when split 6 ways. It amounted to a few $100s per man and a handful of jewelry that would be difficult to fence. The disappointment was palpable. Jesse glared at Dick Little and Charlie Ford, his eyes narrowing. He began to accuse them of holding out, of stealing from the sack before the division. Little, a man with a low tolerance for disrespect, bristled. The tension was electric. Hands hovered near holsters. Frank James had to intervene, speaking in a low, calming voice to prevent a shootout right there in the woods. The blue-cut robbery was the death knell of the gang's cohesion. After the split, the group fractured. Woodhite and Dick Little, who had been simmering with a personal feud over the affections of a woman, were now at open war. Jesse sided with his cousin Wood. The Ford brothers, Charlie and Bob, were caught in the middle, but they were drifting toward Little. They saw that Jesse was spiraling. He was no longer the brilliant tactician. He was a liability. He was violent, unpredictable, and bringing heat down on them for very little reward. The investigation into Blue Cut was aggressive. Governor Crittenden, humiliated by another train robbery in the same location, ramped up the pressure. He met secretly with railroad officials and authorized enormous rewards, not just for the capture of the outlaws, but for their delivery dead or alive. This suspension of the usual legal protocols was a direct response to the brutality witnessed at Blue Cut. The public was no longer charmed. The beating of the messenger and the robbery of the passengers had turned the tide of opinion. The newspapers printed the accounts of the terrified women and the bloodied brakemen. The Robin Hood moniker was now used only in irony. In the weeks following the robbery, the paranoia in Jesse's mind consumed him. He moved his wife Z and their 2 children to St. Joseph, Missouri, renting a house on a hill that offered a view of all approaches. He assumed the name Thomas Howard completely. He did not let his children leave the yard. He sat in the house with the curtains drawn, cleaning his guns, watching the street. He began to suspect everyone. He believed that Dick Little was a traitor. He suspected the Ford brothers were weak. He even began to look at Frank with suspicion, though the bond of blood held them together for the moment. The internal war within the gang turned bloody in December of that year. Woodhite, Jesse's cousin, went to the Ford home in Ray County to confront Dick Little. The argument escalated instantly. Guns were drawn in the dining room. Woodhite fired at Little, wounding him in the leg. Little fired back but missed. Bob Ford, who was present, drew his pistol and shot Woodhite in the head. The cousin of Jesse James was dead, killed by his own Confederates. This murder was the turning point. The Fords and Little had killed Jesse's blood. They knew that if Jesse found out, he would hunt them down and kill them all without hesitation. They buried Woodhite in a shallow grave in the woods, covering the crime, but the secret hung over them like a blade. They were now in a trap. They could not run because Jesse would find them. They could not stay because Jesse would eventually discover the truth about Wood Height. Their only option was to strike first. The Blue Cut robbery, therefore, was the catalyst for the final betrayal. It was the event that proved to the gang that Jesse was losing his grip. It was the event that yielded so little money that it forced them to turn on each other. And it was the event that stripped away the last layer of protection Jesse had, the loyalty of his men. He was now a king without a kingdom, ruling over a court of assassins who were actively plotting his demise. As the winter of 1881 settled over Missouri, Jesse James sat in his house in St. Joseph, unaware that his cousin was rotting in a shallow grave and that the boys he called friends were negotiating his price with the governor. The darkness of the Blue Cut tunnel had followed him home. The violence he had inflicted on the conductor and the messenger was reflecting back on him. He had created a world where only force was respected, and he was about to become the victim of that very world. The paranoia that gripped him was not madness. It was a completely rational response to the reality he had constructed. He was a man alone, surrounded by wolves he had trained to bite. April 3rd, 1882. Arrived in St. Joseph, Missouri with the warming promise of spring, melting the last remnants of winter from the bluffs overlooking the Missouri River. The house at 1318 Lafayette Street stood high on a hill, a modest white-frame cottage that offered a commanding view of the surrounding approaches. Inside this dwelling lived a man known to his neighbors as Mr. Thomas Howard, a cattle buyer and family man. He was 34 years old, though his body carried the scars and wear of a man twice his age. He lived there with his wife, Z, and their 2 children, Jesse Edwards and Mary Susan. But the man was not Thomas Howard. He was Jesse Woodson James, the most hunted man in America. And on this Monday morning, the walls of his sanctuary were closing in on him, not from the outside, but from within. Living as guests in the James household were 2 brothers, Charles and Robert Ford. They had been there for days, eating at Jesse's table and sleeping in his spare room. To Jesse, they were fresh recruits, young men he was grooming for the next robbery, specifically a raid on the Platte City Bank which he had been meticulously planning. To the Ford brothers, however, the house was a cage. They were harboring a secret that would guarantee their execution if discovered. They had participated in the murder of Wood Height, Jesse's cousin, months prior during an argument. They knew that Jesse's loyalty to his blood was absolute. If he found out they had put a bullet in his cousin's head and buried him in a shallow grave, he would kill them both without a moment's hesitation. The pressure was immense. They were trapped between the legendary wrath of the outlaw and the offer from Governor Thomas T. Crittenden, a full pardon, and a massive reward for the delivery of Jesse James. The morning began with a deceptive normalcy. The sun climbed into a clear sky, illuminating the dusty streets of St. Joseph. The household stirred early. Jesse, Z, and the children, along with the Ford brothers, sat down to breakfast in the small dining room. The conversation was mundane, revolving around the plans for the day. Jesse was in high spirits, his mind focused on the upcoming Platte City job. He spoke of the layout of the bank and the timing of the raid. He trusted Charlie Ford, who had ridden with him before, and he was beginning to trust Bob, the younger brother, whom he viewed as eager and malleable. The Fords ate their food, their eyes avoiding the penetrating gaze of their host, their hands trembling slightly as they lifted their coffee cups. Every movement Jesse made, every shift of his body, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were waiting for the moment when the mask would slip, when Jesse would reveal that he knew their secret. After breakfast, the men moved out to the stable behind the house. They spent some time currying the horses, preparing the animals for the journey that Jesse believed they were taking later that night. The physical labor provided a brief distraction, but the tension remained. Jesse was meticulous with the animals, checking their hooves and their flanks. He was a horseman first. and he knew that his life often depended on the stamina of his mount. The Fords worked beside him, brushes in hand, watching his hands. They knew he was armed. He carried his revolvers everywhere, 2 massive .44 caliber Smith & Wessons, even inside the house. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, the trio returned to the house. The day was becoming warm. Jesse removed his coat, tossing it onto a bed in the front room. He was wearing a white shirt, a vest, and trousers. He complained that it was getting hot. Then, he did something he almost never did. He unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy leather rig holstering the 2 revolvers was a constant weight on his hips. He remarked that he should take them off so as not to alarm the neighbors if they happened to look through the windows. He placed the belt and the weapons on the bed, covering them with the coat. For the first time in years, Jesse James was unarmed in the presence of other men. He turned his attention to the room. The house was sparsely furnished, but Z tried to keep it clean. Jesse noticed a picture on the wall that was dusty. It was a needlepoint or a lithograph, possibly of a racehorse named Skyrocket, though accounts vary. He picked up a feather duster and commented that the picture was awfully dusty. He dragged a cane-bottomed chair over to the wall beneath the picture. He stepped up onto the chair, his back to the room, his back to the Ford brothers. He began to dust the picture, his arm moving in rhythmic strokes. This was the moment. The Ford brothers exchanged a silent look. It was now or never. If they hesitated, Jesse might turn around, retrieve his guns, and the opportunity would be gone forever. They could not beat him in a fair fight. His speed and accuracy were supernatural. Assassination was their only path to survival and the reward. Both brothers drew their weapons. Charlie Ford was slow, his hesitation palpable. But Bob Ford, the younger and more ambitious of the two, acted with a cold, terrifying resolve. He drew a nickel-plated Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolver from his pocket. He raised the weapon, leveling it at the back of Jesse's head. The distance was less than 4 feet. Bob Ford squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell. The gun roared in the small confines of the room, a sharp, deafening crack that shattered the domestic quiet. The bullet struck Jesse James behind the right ear. It crashed through the skull and entered the brain. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Jesse did not cry out. He did not turn. His body stiffened for a microsecond, then pitched forward. He fell from the chair, crashing onto the floor on his face. The feather duster dropped from his hand. Blood began to pool rapidly around his head, soaking into the carpet. The man who had survived the Civil War, the Pinkerton raids, and 1,000 miles of hard riding lay dead on the floor of his own living room, killed not by a lawman, but by a guest he had fed that morning. The sound of the gunshot brought Z. James running from the kitchen. She burst into the room and saw her husband lying prone, the blood spreading like a dark halo. She screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. She threw herself onto his body, trying to lift his head. She looked at the Ford brothers, her eyes wide with shock and accusation. She cried out that they had killed him. Bob Ford, his face pale, the smoking gun still in his hand, tried to stammer a justification. He said the gun had gone off by accident. It was a pathetic lie, spoken in the panic of the moment. Z knew the truth. She saw the location of the wound. She saw the weapons on the bed. The Fords did not stay to argue. They turned and fled the house. They ran to the stable, but then, realizing they needed to get to the authorities before a mob formed or Z found a weapon, they ran out the front gate. They did not run into the woods to hide. They ran toward the telegraph office and the city marshal. Their plan relied entirely on the protection of the law. They sent a telegram to Governor Crittenden, a short message that would change history. I have killed Jesse James, St. Joseph, Bob Ford. Back at the house on Lafayette Street, the scene was one of utter tragedy. Z sat on the floor, cradling the head of her dead husband, her dress stained with his blood, The children, hearing the commotion, came into the room. Jesse Edwards, the young son, saw his father dead. The trauma of that moment would imprint itself on the boy forever. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshot and Z's screams, began to gather. They hesitated at the door, fearful that the gang was still inside. When they finally entered, they found the grieving widow and the corpse of the notorious Outlaw. The news spread through St. Joseph with the speed of a prairie fire. "Jesse James is dead!" The cry went up from street to street. Marshal Enos Craig arrived at the scene. He secured the house, pushing back the growing crowd of curiosity seekers who were already trying to tear pieces of wood from the fence and the porch as souvenirs. The body was lifted from the floor and placed on a board. The medical examiner arrived to confirm the death. The bullet had done its work efficiently. There was no need for an autopsy to determine the cause, but the identification was crucial. The world needed to know that this was truly Jesse James. The body was transported to the undertaking establishment of Heaton and Seidenfaden. The Ford brothers surrendered themselves to the authorities, but instead of being hailed as heroes, they were met with a wave of revulsion. They were placed in custody, ostensibly for murder, but with the understanding that the pardon would come. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. When the details of the killing emerged, that Jesse was unarmed, that his back was turned, that he was dusting a picture, the sentiment turned against the Fords. They were branded as cowards. The dirty little coward label that would follow Bob Ford for the rest of his life was forged in the first hours after the shooting. People who had feared Jesse James now despised his killer. There was no honor in shooting a man in the back. The body of Jesse James was placed on display at the funeral home. Thousands of people lined up to see him. They filed past the coffin, staring at the waxen face of the man who had terrorized the Midwest for 16 years. The crowds were so large that the police had to struggle to maintain order. Photographers were allowed in to take pictures of the corpse. One famous image showed Jesse strapped to a cooling board, his eyes closed, looking more like a sleeping farmer than a legendary killer. These photographs were sold as postcards, gruesome souvenirs that circulated across the nation. The identification process was thorough. People who had known Jesse from his youth, former guerrillas, and even his mother, Zerelda Samuel, were brought in. Zerelda arrived, a formidable figure with her empty sleeve pinned up. She looked at the body of her son and wept, but her grief quickly turned to rage. When she saw the Ford brothers later at the inquest or in the custody of the law, she screamed at them. She called them traitors and vipers. She cursed them with a biblical fury. Her performance cemented the narrative of the grieving mother and the martyred son, stripping away the crimes and leaving only the tragedy. The inquest was a formality. The Ford brothers testified, describing the events of the morning with a cold detachment. They admitted to the plot. They admitted to the deal with the governor. The jury found them guilty of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to hang. However, within 2 hours of the verdict, Governor Crittenden issued the promised pardon. They were free men. But their freedom was a curse. They walked out of the courthouse into a world that hated them. They were pariahs. They tried to capitalize on their fame, touring in cheap stage plays where they reenacted the murder, but the audiences booed them and threw vegetables. Jesse James was buried on the family farm in Kearney, under a large coffee bean tree in the yard, close to the house so that Zerelda could watch over the grave and prevent ghouls from digging him up. The funeral was a massive event. Neighbors, friends, and the curious gathered to hear the eulogies. The preacher spoke of his kindness to his mother and his love for his family, conveniently ignoring the bank tellers he had pistol-whipped and the soldiers he had slaughtered. The myth was already overtaking the man. The rough edges were being sanded down. The death of Jesse James marked the end of an era. The frontier was closing. The telegraph, the railroad, and the coordinated efforts of the state had finally caught up with the outlaw. but the manner of his death ensured his immortality. Had he been killed in a gunfight with the Pinkertons, he would have been just another bandit. By dying at the hands of a traitor shot in the back while unarmed, he was transformed into a victim. The brutality of his own actions, the murder of Haywood, the beating of Grimes, the slaughter at Centralia, faded into the background, overshadowed by the treachery of Bob Ford. For the Ford brothers, the reward money was quickly spent or lost. Charlie Ford, consumed by guilt and the morphine addiction he developed to cope with the public hatred, committed suicide in May of 1884. Bob Ford drifted west, opening saloons in Colorado, always looking over his shoulder. He was eventually shot to death in his own tent saloon in Creede, Colorado in 1892 by a man named Edward O'Kelly. There was no mourning for Bob Ford. He died as he had lived, a man defined by a single act of cowardice. Z. James lived the rest of her life in relative poverty and seclusion, struggling to raise her children under the shadow of their father's name. She died in 1900, depressed and broken. Jesse Edwards James, the son, grew up to be a lawyer, living a respectable life that was the antithesis of his father's. He bore the burden of the name with dignity, but he could never fully escape the legacy of the man who died on the floor when he was a boy. The narrative of Jesse James is a tapestry woven with threads of violence, greed, and tragedy. It began in the blood-soaked fields of the Civil War and ended in a quiet living room in St. Joseph. The reality was gritty and non-poetic. There was no romance in the way he bled out on the carpet. There was no glory in the hole in his skull. It was a sordid, ugly end to a life built on inflicting pain. The Robin Hood was a fabrication, a mask worn to hide the face of a killer. But in death, the mask became the face. The dime novels printed millions of copies, the songs were written. And the ruthless killer who murdered unarmed men became the misunderstood hero of the American West. The final irony lies in the dusting of the picture. For a man who lived by the gun, who survived ambushes and raids, to be killed while performing a mundane household chore is the ultimate testament to the unpredictable nature of violence. He lowered his guard for 10 seconds and it cost him everything. The heat of that April morning, the smell of the gun smoke in the small room, the sound of Z's scream. These are the sensory details that define the end. The legend floated away like the dust from the picture, leaving behind only the cold, hard fact of a dead man on the floor and a traitor running out the door. The West had been tamed, not by the law but by treachery, and the ghost of Jesse James would haunt the American imagination forever.